It's
Okay, thank you all for joining us. Earlier this week, we released a short video talking about some of the design decisions that led to us calling the blockchain initially the Gajimaru as a kind of a project name, and then why that really stuck. That this was the idea of creating a proof of work mint with proof of stake and or proof of authority associate chains could be viewed just like we saw the Gajimaru. And we touched into some of the points there, but actually, this is a massively complex subject. And I'm really lucky to have three experts in this world sitting with us. So I'm going to pass over to them and ask them to talk you through some of the issues, starting with what is proof of work versus what is proof of stake, and understanding some of the positives and negatives. And really the intention here is to have a fairly free-flow conversation between everybody as opposed to something we're trying to condense into a very short period. So over to you guys. Thank you.
To who?
well,
Dimitar.
Whoever wants to get started.
yeah. Dimitar's got a good way of describing proof of work for sure.
So blockchains. So blockchains actually don't care about proof of work or proof of stake. This is that we need. What blockchains are a big ledger, and it is a pen-only ledger. We only add transactions at the bottom. So every time someone early sends Bob 10 gachus, they produce a transaction, and it gets included to the ledger. Gets to include that is why we need a consensus mechanism that specifies who is allowed to produce blocks. Blocks are containers for transactions, essentially. So we add transactions in chunks. We collect a few transactions and we add them in a block. Then we collect some, we add them. And the one that adds transactions to the blockchain is the block producer. In the case of proof of work, that would be a miner. In case of proof of stake, I think it's block producer. There are different approaches of how and who can produce those blocks, and Gajimaru takes a relatively uncharted approach that is that adds more elasticity. So we have two types of blocks. Declare you as a block producer, and another that actually contains transactions when they're needed. Bitcoin does something different. What they do is they produce blocks every 10 minutes. And no matter if there is a high load or low load, there will be a new block every 10 minutes. And in our approach, blocks are being produced when they're needed. So once we need more blocks, we produce more blocks. And if we don't, there are no blocks on the blockchain.
So actually, you raise a really good point there, because before we get into proof of work versus proof of stake, I think there's been an incredible amount of misinformation out there about what is a blockchain. When we talk about the Gajimaru, and I've been saying this in social media, I've been saying this in presentations to people, is it's an actual blockchain that really works with a real cryptocurrency that actually works. And to some degree, I was being antagonistic in what I was saying because I was trying to poke a few of the bears out there. But actually, it's also true, which is why it's antagonistic. We're sitting in an industry that has spent far more money on marketing than it ever has on innovation. And that marketing has really been focused on how to obscure facts as opposed to expose them, discuss them. And one of the things I think is very true is people don't even know what a blockchain is, and why it's important for it to be a blockchain. And I think we can touch into some of this when we start talking about the issues around proof of stake and the magical creation of money, which you might argue is directly derived from modern monetary theory. Although I think we would all laugh at the idea that that's a theory rather than just a childish, stupid thing to allow people to do. But
How dare you?
Before I get diverted into that, years ago, I used to try and explain a blockchain like a marketplace. And I said, so if you take all the technology away and you put us into sort of a Renaissance era marketplace. How might that work? So everybody, let's say there's no money other than the money that you declare that you have coming in the door. There's no product other than the product you declare you have coming in the door. So everybody comes into the marketplace with a ledger, and their ledger says, I have X, let's say for now that it's, give me a currency.
Petrol.
No, because this is Renaissance era. So there's no pounds,
Lira.
there's definitely
Okay,
no
that one.
euros.
That one. Lira.
Talents. Okay, so
Ooh.
I come into the marketplace. We're going right back to the time of Jesus now. So I come into the marketplace and I have 10 talents, which I declare as I walk in, and I have 20 bags, or whatever the measurement of the time would be. I really screwed myself up there. 20 kilos of apples, which I wish to sell in the marketplace. And then as the marketplace unfolds, what might happen is that there's a transaction between, let's say, Dimitar and I, where he buys some apples from me, and I then have 12 talents, and he has 8, having come in with 10. But I'm down 2 kilos of apples. He's up 2 kilos of apples. And how do you know that the transaction occurred? And how can we trust that the transaction occurred if it's just the two of us? It's a he said, she said type, or he said in this particular instance type issue.
So your question is how, when you go to buy some lamp from Wolf, how does he know that you have the 12 talents that you say you do? Because I gave it to you, right?
Well, and further, how does, when you're leaving, why doesn't Greg tell the guard, he took 2 of my apples
Correct.
Yeah.
when I wasn't
So-
looking?
So
He only had 8 talents when he came in.
how can you trust that the marketplace is a place in which you can do good business genuinely?
Hmm.
There has to be some sort of mechanism for guarding all of these points. So what you might do instead is say that every single transaction has to be shouted out to the whole marketplace, and everybody pulls out their scribe and slate and says, aha, Dimitar has paid 2 talents for 2 kilograms of Greg's apples. Dimitar has given Greg 2 talents. Greg has given Dimitar 2 kilograms of apples. The contract has now been completed, and put that into the list. The thing of it is, if everybody is doing that, who is the one that's checking that everybody has got the same answer and then entering that into the marketplace ledger? And maybe it's a clumsy metaphor. It probably is actually. But what I'm trying to get at is understanding that that act of consensus might have been the town crier, for example. Who is that? Because when you look at how marketplaces and how markets have evolved and operated through all the centuries that we are aware of, it's always ended up in somebody becoming the person that decides whether a transaction occurred or not. In the Dark Ages, that was the Catholic Church, which is why the Catholic Church is so phenomenally rich. Yeah, they became the middleman to every transaction, and God blessed the ones that paid them the most.
How dare you?
But this is also true in the Islamic world. The mosques were the same. They were, I know we have to be careful, but look, the fact is, where there wasn't an empire type force in the past, whether that was the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, whatever it was, there ended up being some sort of a mechanism of control, a centralization. And what you end up with is this state where the people who own the infrastructure, the platform of trade, make more money than anyone else does. And they have total control over their ability to make that money.
There's a social historical point that's worth pointing out here too, though, which is that society in the past, issues that we now say are social, which now fall under government purview, were not concentrated in government previously. That's very unusual, and we have this weird aggregation since World War II for who knows why. But the social functions of things like healthcare, governance, policymaking, military, these were all kind of different branches of society that were often at odds with one another and unified only at certain moments of need. But now everything is under one kind of centralized in a really weird way in terms of like policy authority. I just think there's maybe some hints there and it's worth pointing out.
Yeah, so look, at the risk of opening a complete Pandora's box here, the point that we're trying to get to, I think, is that what is a blockchain? Why do you need one? And then get to how it works and the way it can reach consensus. Because essentially, that act of describing consensus, that there's a finality that we're going to stand over at this point, is where in the past, somebody could control that state, that position, and thereby control the market, control everything else. They became the one source of truth. So I paraphrase this when I say that the object of a blockchain is to allow us to trust the message, not the messenger, securely at scale. That in the past, we trusted the messenger of this statement that this is the truth. But we no longer need to. If we have enough points of consensus from a public forum, actually, we don't need to trust one voice, one messenger. We can trust the message itself. And it's a tiny but massive innovation.
This idea of the ledger being the history, the chronicle, time can be an illusion, but the sequence is true. Who gets to make that decision? That's the critical thing being decided in the consensus system. As we're in most blockchains, not everywhere, but in most blockchains, that's the question: is who's the one that's allowed to update this ledger? Why does he have authority right now? And to have that authority has to be a costly signal. You're part of the clergy, for example. You've given up all future of marriage and children. You've given up family perpetually to get this. So that's a costly signal that, yeah, maybe they're corrupt, they're doing weird political stuff in the background. However, it's a huge cost signal to even get that position at all. What's the cost signal for being the sole source of truth when it comes to money if you're a central bank dealing in fiat currency? I don't know. That's sort of an open, weird question, and there's a wild tale of chaos at the end of it instead of reducing chaos over time. So there's an unpredictable factor there, which is really dangerous. So this question of who has the authority to make those updates, who has the authority to update this ledger that has legal authority over people's future. If that ledger says something that's wrong, somebody might get their hand chopped off. So this is actually quite important. What's in that ledger and who wrote it and why did they write that there? So their motives have to be in line with what they're doing. And a very costly signal is the only way to trust that person at that moment. So that's sort of the conundrum that's trying to be solved by a consensus system. And it was solved in the past with a very short bridge to violence quite often. And today we're trying to distribute that across the network in a way that we can't reach out and touch that guy. We don't even know who it is sometimes because society is like massive now.
Furthermore, if they try cheating, I, having my own node, taking care of my own interest, is going to validate that the incoming transaction wrapped in the block is once my node decides that, okay, this is a valid transaction, the whole block with transactions is kicked out. And it's not allowed into my view of the blockchain. So my node protects my interest. So I have this computer, this service that is protecting my interest, even if the block producer is malicious and trying to. So it's going to protect my interest and say that, okay, that's invalid, move along, we're not going to accept that. So even if there's a central authority that is changing and it's decentralized, even if someone is malicious and trying to actively manipulate something, they can manipulate only the present, they cannot change the past, which is a radical change to traditional software, where you have access to the database and you can actually change the database from the past. The blockchain strictly prohibits that, but you can still manipulate what is being put into the next block if you are the block producer. And if you happen to do so, everyone else is going to be punishing you and not accepting your block. So that's a big change from traditional software as well. So it's tamper-proof, and you have the incentive to behave well. Otherwise, the whole chain is going to ostracize you.
So I guess we could also mention that, I mean, one thing that people tend to not know is why it's called cryptocurrency in the first place. And
Yeah, the mechanism. I think we didn't describe the mechanism yet.
so the mechanisms for tamper-proofing the chain and proving that the content hasn't been manipulated, that it is based on technology from cryptography, essentially algorithms that were developed for cryptography. So that's how you're proving authenticity and verifying that the transactions, once they get on the chain, have actually been added in an orderly fashion. So, but we still have the problem of who gets to choose what gets onto the chain. And when you have no central authority, no middlemen, then we have to come up with some method of doing this that makes it hard for people to spam the chain or to censor the chain or otherwise attack the chain. And this is where proof of work comes in.
Yeah, but it also has to be provable. So if you're the leader, everyone else on the chain must be able to validate that you indeed are the leader. So you cannot say, I'm the leader, trust me, everything is going to be fine. We all must agree that indeed you're the output of whatever the mechanism is. And proof of work and proof of stake are two of the many mechanisms to elect the next leader that are out there.
Just on
proof
this
of work-
thing that you've touched on, trust me, this is something that I've been very passionate about for a long time. You know, I spent a lot of time and my own money trying to build the first version of what QPQ is, the idea of the internal of economics. And it failed because it was centralized. And this was in the early 2000s. I didn't know about decentralization. And the reason why I've been such a passionate believer in the ideas of the blockchain and decentralization is because of the lessons I learned then. That actually it's really hard to get to trust, and that it should be. And whilst I often argue that where you hear trust, you should hear regulation, which I'll come to in a second, even with all of the regulatory cover in the world, trust is still a hard thing to get to. You know, a point that I made in the run-up to the global financial crisis and a lot afterwards, without trying to sound like too much of a conceited ass, was that at that time, the idea that the state can be everywhere like a panoptical thing and can know the truth of everything, and that the regulator can know the truth of everything, is simply a fallacy. So most things become an ex blow-up review of what went wrong, but actually the lessons that have been learned cannot be learned because there simply isn't the capacity to learn them. You cannot be everywhere at once unless you have multiple points of confirmation of everything that happens, but I'll come to that. So trust is a really hard thing to achieve, and it should be. It's a really hard thing to maintain, and it should be. The only protection that we have in the existing system is an imperfect one. It's one in which we give regulators the capacity to ensure that people who are put in positions of trust are trustworthy, that there are checks and balances that can make sure that what they're doing can be audited. But ultimately, as I point out to people, it's a little bit like the frigates and destroyers that would escort ships across the North Atlantic during the First and Second World War. For the most part, the submarines knew where they were, knew what they were doing, and their job was to go around the picket line and take out the merchantmen. And this is still the case in the current economy, that essentially by the time the merchant seaman is sinking in the water, surrounded by burning fuel, it's too late for that merchant seaman and all the people on that boat and all of the supplies on that boat. They have been lost. And the prosecution of the submarine thereafter by the frigates and destroyers that were the picket line is a nice to have, but it isn't going to change the position. And we've seen this
Yeah,
again and
it's almost
again
like
and
law
again.
enforcement in war. It doesn't really work out.
Correct. So we've seen this again and again and again, whether it was the long-term capital management blow-up in the early 90s, the irrational exuberance of the late 90s, early 2000s, or indeed the global financial crisis of 2008 through to arguably the present, because it's still rumbling on. We do not know the moment, locus, or quantum of risk in the system. We cannot know it. The idea that centralized authorities can know all of these things in a sort of a panoptical way is absolute nonsense. So what can we trust? And the answer, in truth, is nothing. This is really, when people say, what's the point of blockchain? This is the thing I try and get to, is I try and say, well, why do you trust the existing system? How many times does it need to screw you and everybody you know over before you'll start to learn that actually you can't trust it? Because even with the best will in the world and the most hardworking, diligent, honest people in regulatory positions and in the entities that they're trying to regulate, you are still going to have bad actors. You are still going to have mistakes. You're going to have errors. You're going to have all sorts of problems. And actually, those problems don't go away. They compound.
Mm-hmm.
And they ripple throughout the system because one risk is not known to another. I mean, with long-term capital management in the early 90s, what we saw was that a hedge fund was so enormous that actually it had completely contrary positions to itself, in addition to the hedging positions that it was taking to get the best alpha on its outcomes. When they started to unwind that, it was completely out of control, and that's one entity. So
Yeah, you would think they would know what their own risks with themselves were,
right,
but it's that complicated. I'm going to steal just a little bit of time from you. We're the three of us here talking on the programming side. We all write distributed systems and we write concurrent systems. Even inside of a single computer, we write concurrent systems most often. And I can write a complete system from beginning to end. Every line of code is mine, nobody else's. And once it starts to go, if it's a concurrent system that does something even somewhat non-trivial, even though I wrote it and I know every single line in it, I may have even memorized it, I can't tell you what the state of it is at a given moment. People don't get that when they think, oh, we have computing power, we can have a central authority. No. I can write a toy system. Press the go button. I can know everything about it that there is to know. And I can't tell you actually at a given, if say pause, what's the state of memory right now? I can't tell you. Because I sort of hinted as a joke earlier, but literally time is not real. It's a relativistic effect that we feel it as an effect. It's not a force. Gravity is that way too, which is really, that gets weird. But anyway, sequence, relative sequence, observed sequence, that is true. And that's the only locus that you have of control as a single actor in a system. And you've got all these different actors and they're all seeing a different sequence of events quite often. Now that's chaotic. It's explosively chaotic the more actors you have. And this is one of the fundamental asymmetries of the universe, is that as you go forward in time, you have an explosive number of possibilities, and that's genuine chaos. That's disorder. That's the heart of entropy. But in the past direction, we've only got one path that we got from where we were before to how we are now. So we can remember that. The future's there, but we can't remember it because it's too much. It gets bigger this way and it gets smaller that way. We got one line coming here, and then we're all these possibilities of what might come next. Humans work together to mitigate that chaos going forward by doing things like having expensive trust signals. And I can say, okay, I'm going to loan Greg $10 because I've seen him do stuff so far. We had our little, Mexican standoff a couple of times to feel each other out, but I get him now. He gets me. I've seen him perform. I'm going to give him $10 on the promise that $10 he's going to provide more value to and give back to me later. And if not, I'm going to be upset and take it out of him. Okay. So, but we have that agreement. We know that that's a thing. And we're going to work together because together we're definitely stronger than either one of us alone. So we're going to cooperate to try to manage the chaos into the future because I don't know enough stuff about what's coming next to do it by myself, and neither does he. But together we've got a little bit of a better chance. We're more robust. So this is a robustness. It's a robustness formulation, kind of like how your body can, because you got a bunch of cells, any one of them that gets all messed up can kind of be picked up by the others and the system can move on. People work together to create societies, families, whatever, to perform a robustness function very similar to this. But it's all because the future's scary. It's uncertain. It's explosively chaotic. And we have to work together to mitigate that. And if you have a system of trust that exists already, and it only exists because you just say it's trusted, but you don't know each other, it's an abstract trust now. You have a layer at which, I mean, when you get to something like government or companies or whatever,
Or the courts.
or the courts, you could have a perverse incentive within that system that encourages them to work together for their interest against yours, but they are the authority that you've given your right to violence to. You've given your right to litigation to. You've given your right to policy, your representation within policy making. You've given all that to them already. And now they've got, because it's abstract, they don't live down the street from you. You can't be like, hey, dude, what the hell's going on with this decision about whatever? You're gonna break my house down and build a road here, but you didn't talk to me about it. That's when everything was in local villages, you could do that. And sometimes there were fistfights over such things. But now the council's this abstract thing. The government's this abstract thing. You don't know the cops in your neighborhood because they're not in your neighborhood. It's the universal force. Now we've got all these aggregate bodies that are larger than a village, which means you don't know people anymore. So we're aggregating trust at this weird level where it's now impersonal. And there's no longer, oh, well, who needs help this week? I know that Brian got fired from his job. I know that Susie's getting sick. I know that, Karen just had a child. So I need to look after these people because I know them. That's the old way. Now we say, well, statistically, 2% of people lost this and 1% of people had a kid and whatever. So we're going to, from the center where you can't know anything but these abstract statistics and you don't know who the names are behind these numbers. You're trying to make these number-based decisions about human things. You're essentially trying to regulate compassion. And this is a recipe for someone to come in who's a snake and go, I lack compassion, but I know that's a powerful impulse in people. And I can leverage this. I can give a compassionate story to people, dress it up with numbers. They have to trust me because I'm the authority. And the answer will be, give me all your money, give me all your authority, and I promise I'm going to help you out because I'm the good daddy guy. And this will always get bent out of proportion.
Well,
So
it
in
did.
this system where we've got a huge
Yeah,
number of
look,
people,
This
how
is
do we
what we
trust them?
touched on earlier. This is the whole thing with the churches.
Yeah,
At the point where the Roman Empire, speaking to a Western context, at the point where the Roman Empire fell away, and no longer was there a marketplace governed by the governor of the town, the village, the region, and that no longer had an audience with him and a system of justice. The church stepped in. The church itself in each village became the arbiter of truth and became this allegedly incorruptible central authority, but it turned out to be completely corruptible. And everything you've said feeds into actually where my journey into this whole industry came from. It started in early 2001, I think it was. In fact, before that, because before that I'd read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations and taken on board a lot of the ideas of Stoicism, which essentially say that you must take responsibility for yourself and you cannot blame others for the things that you do, for the choices that you make. But coming to that was with that perspective, and then reading a book called Against the Gods, The Story of Risk by a chap called Bernstein. Understanding that everything in our lives is about managing risk, and you identified that. You said, so I can trust. What's the trust signal, etc. All of these things come back to our need as human beings, as animals, as anything, to be able to determine the risks that we're taking and try to manage those risks best we can. And right now, and this is the point I was trying to get at, was the thing that really opened up for me was I thought, but hold on. We don't know the risks. At no point in time could somebody look at the existing economic system and tell me what the moment, locus, and quantum of risk is. I made the analogy that what we saw in 2008 was a bit like a game of musical chairs. So there's 100 actors playing a game of musical chairs who happen to be the world's biggest financial institutions. And the music goes off, the lights go on, and they find that there's only 60 chairs. So 60 fun fight their way onto the chairs. 20 end up sitting on the laps of people that they have managed to convince to let them sit on their lap, and 20 ping off the wall. And we, the people, the society at large, ended up with the socialization of risk. And the great disparity was that we had a privatization of profit and a socialization of risk, but risk that nobody actually understood or knew. And we still don't. You know, people talk about inflation, they talk about price, they talk about incomes, and they're not getting the point that we have created so much money between then and now. We still haven't fully realized the risks. Because as I point out to people, until a cup of coffee costs 12 times more than it did in the year 2000, we haven't caught up with the inflation of money supply. And unfortunately, your salary is going to continue to stay where it is. So it will get to a point where having a cup of coffee becomes a luxury item akin to a steak dinner today. But sorry, I'm digressing because
No, but it's worth
the
stabbing
point,
out the
the point I
toothpick again.
wanted to say to people is that people say, why blockchain? And I say, well, why haven't you looked at the fact that the risks in the current system are so endemic and so impossible that there is no choice?
How did you phrase that a second ago?
Choice.
How did you phrase it a second ago? Because it's perfect. You said privatization of
Profit, socialization of risk.
that.
Yep.
Is perfect.
No,
And
actually,
it's-
also
Boom.
the thing that happened in 2008 was the culmination of something that had been actually known, certainly in the finance sector, for many years. I remember hearing that, after 9/11, that was surprising in many ways. One of the things that really surprised and scared the hell out of people in the finance sector was that the effect of the World Trade Center coming down wasn't bigger, because the initial scare was that it would basically crash Wall Street. It would just basically wreck the entire Western economy. And it just got absorbed. It was like whoosh. And very little, it crashed actually. And while that might have seemed like a saving grace, the people who were supposed to be on top of the risk exposure in the finance sector got terrified, because they realized that they had absolutely no idea what happened, and they didn't know what their exposure was. They didn't know why they were saved at that time, and they realized that they had a lot of work to do to figure out what their actual exposure was, because they knew that there were bugs in the system, like the subprime loans in the US. Everyone knew that that was going to lead to a real estate crash, because it wasn't sustainable. There was gonna be a crash in the future, and so the big problem for many of the finance actors was trying to get a hold of their exposure, trying to peel that back, and make sure that they would survive the crash that they knew was coming, without telling anyone. Because if you start telling people that, okay, we're heading for a crash and we're not ready for it, then you trigger the crash that you know that you're not ready for. And so this sort of starts a game of essentially lying to people, the people you're worried that will stampede and create the disaster that you can see on the horizon that you're still not prepared for. And then after 2008, what do we do? Well, essentially start printing money and keeping it afloat on steroids, essentially. pumping up the market so that it seems like it's still working. And then, of course, the idea would have been to try to recover while you're on steroids so that you can get off it and get back to normal behavior. But that never really happened.
No, because the people got addicted to the steroids.
And in Sweden, we're seeing a bunch of bankruptcies
It's
now
inherited in the
of
system.
people who are bailed out during COVID, or companies that were bailed out during COVID, that shouldn't have been. They
This,
weren't
this,
in good health then, and they still aren't. And now the debts are due, and they are now going bankrupt. But of course, this also became artificial competition for the healthy companies, perhaps who were too healthy to get bailed out during COVID, who are now having to compete with the zombies that got an injection and didn't have to go bankrupt. So we have so many of these things that we've been seeing.
there's 2 points that follow straight. Well, okay. One point that was an indicator to me back, I think around 2006, when I started really paying attention to CCP economy. What they noticed when they realized that their central planning, and they knew that
Sorry,
they've been
CCP
loaning-
as in Chinese Communist Party.
Yes. Yeah, Chinese not the game
not
company. They're cool.
no.
No, the game company, the Chinese Communist Party. They started getting worried when they knew that they were adding a factor of like a bullshit factor to each level of reporting from local up to central government in economic stats, because everyone's got to make numbers. It's a big, that's how it is. However, when they started price fixing certain staples like eggs, and then the black market price of eggs was lower than the official price of eggs. And so they dropped the official price of eggs, and yet the black market price of eggs would go yet lower again. They started realizing we have no idea what supply chains actually look like. If something bad happens, what do? They never got to the bottom of it. Then they started having real estate issues up and down, which is up in the sense that values kept going up, down in the sense that people were actually not building anything anymore. Quite often, they're just on paper. No one's ever seen the property that they think they bought. And it's just paper trade. Sounds familiar if you're a crypto person. That's obviously a bubble that's going to implode at some point. And now China's kind of exporting inflation to these impossible junk bonds. Like, no company in the universe can pay a 10-year 13% junk bond. That's not a thing. But they do.
Hold on. I'm going to quote my favorite Bitcoin fan.
Yeah, right. So
And say that apparently, with DeFi, you can expect 70% returns, not 70% returns. But hold on. DeFi is a whole, DeFi should mean decentralized finance. It should be how you get a corporate loan or a mortgage or a car loan from a decentralized pool of lenders. But it's become this complete rubbish of staking ETH and Bitcoin and so on. And
that's on the second point I was going to
I always get into the fun of this, which is, okay, so who's paying the interest that's giving you these 70% yields? And it's like, yeah, well, people who are using it to do what? What economic activity is there that is so lucrative that it can afford to pay those kind of interest rates? Oh, that's right. It's Ponzi schemes, scams, and fraud. Let's move on. Coming back to the point of why do we need a blockchain? We need a blockchain, I would argue, because the risk of not having one has been proven to be so great that it is not a choice. The question then becomes, what kind of a blockchain do you need to have, and how does it work? And how can it work in a way that people talk about the blockchain trilemma, which is that you can have security, decentralization, and speed, pick two. But actually, we've kind of cheated in order to be able to pick two twice, effectively.
Yeah, because we can pick at what moment is which one, in what context is what important. And
Right.
That's the same distributed system, the CAP theorem. You can have consistency, availability, or partition tolerance, pick two.
So
Engineering
maybe
conundrum.
take that and run
Same
with it.
thing.
Explain some of that to people, the cap theorem point, and how that then leads to us making the kind of choices that we're talking about between proof of work and proof of stake and the consensus mechanisms. Because I was actually very wrong to open this up with a let's talk about proof of stake and proof of work, and maybe spend an hour
We're
going
getting
through
there.
it, because actually
We are getting there, actually.
we're getting there.
Yeah.
But it's a much bigger topic than
So-
I think we can even cover in this, but maybe we can get into some of the top level of the weeds.
Okay, so three. I'll lead this off with a description of why the puzzle matters and what property the puzzle has to have. And let me preface that though by saying that the things he's talking about are the blockchain trilemma, meaning that you've got three properties that are desirable and you can only have two at a time.
Maximum.
That-
You can have only one or less. You can always have less.
You can all... That's true. Yeah, we could just pick one.
You can pick all three and get none, is your point.
Hang on, wait. I'm going to make the most secure
my
blockchain
point
ever. I'm
is-
going to write something down here and then I'm
Whoever
going to
says they
park
have
it and
all
it's
three-
done. I got one security.
No,
So
no,
there's
my
the-
point
the-
is whoever is making a claim that they got all three, they broke speed of light, essentially.
Yeah, right. And so that directly goes to the CAP theorem, which I just mentioned, consistency, availability, and partition tolerance. So consistency means that all the nodes in your system know the same thing at once. Which implies that there's a communication task and a verification task. That every
Yeah.
node can agree that they all know the same thing. And that takes time because speed of light's not just a good idea, it's the law. So that's an important barrier to getting a distributed system to work. So that's consistency. We all know the same thing. Availability is that anytime someone asks a question of that system, at any point in that system, you can get an answer back from it. It doesn't just wait you're not like blocking, waiting for a long time to get a response. It's very responsive. So low latency, that's availability. Then P is partition tolerance, meaning if I've got a big ring of nodes and I chop it in half, is this side the true side or is that side the true side? Or are they aware that they've broken, or are they able to tolerate that there was a partition? And then the really hard part is when that network partition, so you have a net split, they can't talk to each other. Earthquake in Taiwan. Oh, the cable's broken. Now you repair the cable. Can they come back together and can they recover to a unified view of the world again? That's a really fun in the kind of 7 23-hour days of fun, kids, like that kind of fun problem to try to solve.
So in computer science, we call that a pathological problem, in that in the general sense, there is no solution. There is no generic solution to it. You can customize a solution for your particular scenario where you choose your trade-offs. There are going to
Right.
be trade-offs. And for example, in your particular situation, you may accept data loss, specific data loss or whatever. In other situations, you may not be able to, and then maybe you'll have to resort to manually deconflicting everything. So it depends. It depends on your situation and what you're willing to trade off in order to get back online, essentially. But
Right. And
there's
there's
no magic bullet. It's provably impossible to solve in the general case.
right. So
Something
Unless-
is going to bite you.
there's one more trilemma that applies here, which is the engineering trilemma, which is that a project can be cheap, quickly accomplished, can be cheap, fast, and correct, but you can only get two of those.
Maximum.
That's the other problem. So there's three layers of trilemma that are all equally pathological. Now, the trick here is that reducing expectations is actually a very powerful way of achieving greater happiness in your life. So let's say that the game server's down when you want to play. That's the universe telling you that you should want to waste less of your time. Don't play the game that day. Just move on and do something else. So if you can apply that sort of thinking to the design of a system, Now you can get closer to the solution. So instead of trying to get all three things at one time, because you're never going to do that, you can just, if you try to do that, you're just going to fail, period. If you pick which aspects are important in which contexts, you can start whittling down to two things at a time across that matrix. And you may be able to create new contexts in which the third thing you were missing is now prioritized over one of the others. And you may be able to find a good trade-off. And that's kind of what we've been able to do with the Gajimaru roughly. But again, that has to be an engineered, thought through design. That's a design task. That's why
So
it's designed. It doesn't just fall
in
on
what you're
its back.
saying, I actually hear my favorite philosophy yet again speaking out, which is that of Stoicism. It's the actually you're responsible for the choices you make. But I think the big point that you're all making is that people really need to grasp that there is no one answer. There is no one ring to rule them all. You know, again, I've made this point before. Everything that J.R. Tolkien was trying to say about the corruption of the one ring that rules them all was expressed in Gollum. So,
And Gollum happens to be the Federal Reserve chairman. So there we are.
well, yeah,
Oh.
Greenspan does look a little bit like him, and to be fair, he started this mess. But
Oh,
anyway,
wow, that's kind of creepy.
it is, isn't it?
I need
um,
to AI some glasses on the Gollum. That would be perfect.
Dude, it is so obvious that Gollum was done on Alan Greenspan. He's like Droopy mixed with. It's like Droopy and Gollum had a child. Remember the cartoon
Wow.
Droopy of the dog that just was everywhere and really deadpan? That one. Anyway,
Oh, man.
the thing that you're, jokes aside, the thing that you're really pointing at is this issue that, and it's a really important point for people to get. Everything that we choose to do is a compromise. We are compromising something somewhere. There is no perfect answer. It's not 2 + 2 = 4 because it's 2 + X = Y is the equation that we're always dealing with. And we're trying to optimize what Y might be. And therefore, we're trying to control what the other variable X might be.
Right. So in that context, so
But one second. The other thing is X and Y change constantly. What you want X to be as a function of what you want Y to be the outcome are always changing. So forcing people to make one choice forever and ever, amen, is actually really, really dumb. And
yeah,
that's exactly what I think at its heart the Gajimaru is overcoming. It's saying we have an answer here for this particular set of problems and this specific set of issues. But actually, if you want to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G, then go over there and do that with that chain or with that associated chain, or start one of your own, or bring together a group of people and do it yourself. We're trying to create that optionality that allows you to apply a different X to a different Y in order to get what you want from it.
And I think one really important thing here is once you accept that, yeah, there are always going to be trade-offs. You have to choose your trade-offs carefully. One thing that becomes really important in a design, an architecture like what we're working on is clarity. That to quote the legendary computer scientist Sir Anthony Hoare, there are two ways of conducting a software design. One is to make it so simple that there are obviously no deficiencies. The other is to make it so complex that there are no obvious deficiencies. The former method is far more difficult. So I think we not only have we worked really hard at coming up with a system, an ecosystem where we carefully choose our trade-offs. We also try to come up with solutions that are where the trade-offs are clear, where you actually understand which choices you're making. And some problems we're not going to be able to make go away because they are intrinsic. For example, like the CAP theorem, the blockchain trilemma. I'm reminded of a big boss once in a huge project who was talking to in an all-staff meeting, and he was talking about the project trilemma, like the thing that price, time to market, and quality. And he was sort of paying homage to that and saying, but now we're gonna focus on time to market. And of course, all the engineers were going, "No, that's not what it means." You know,
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
but,
but those
what
are-
you're saying is true. I mean, look, I bought many years ago, I bought my parents this 1997 BMW C250, and it's 2.5 liter diesel engine. And I remember at the time saying to my parents, it will probably outlast you, because it was the last of the Mercedes-Benz that were built to survive a nuclear holocaust when engineers ran Mercedes-Benz. In the years very soon thereafter, the early 2000s, right the way through until the early teens, Mercedes build quality went through the floor because all of a sudden accountants ran Mercedes. I used to joke. Do you guys remember Tyco?
That sounds familiar. 737.
There was a guy called Kowalski. I can't actually, maybe it wasn't Kowalski. That might be me having watched Top Gun with my son the other day. But I'm pretty sure it was something along those lines. And he ran this company, Tyco. He wanted to be Jack Welch. He wanted to overtake GE. And he and everybody on the board of Tyco were accountants. I remember saying to people at the time, I wouldn't trust anything that they say. Why? Because they're all experts in cooking books. And if everybody on the board of a company is a book cooker, the books are cooked. And I remember a lot of people being shocked at the revelations that came out of Tyco, including his gold leaf shower curtain in his office that he shared with, I think, his mistress. But anyway, digress. The point.
Jeez.
Go on.
No, I just like,
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So
wow.
the thing of it is, we do make all of these compromise choices, and we do try and pretend that we don't in all sorts of different ways. And certainly in a marketing context, people try and pretend this. But to your point,
Yeah.
every engineer in that meeting would have been going, no, that's the worst two choices to make. Time to market and cost. Those are the worst two choices. You need to make
Or
a
just taking the
qualitative
wrong
choice.
lesson. Like,
Yeah.
this is a bullet list that every project's got to meet, and we're going to do all three. And today we're going to do this one. It's like, that's the
Yeah.
wrong
Well,
lesson,
and
dude.
the-
But I mean,
You
the
didn't listen carefully. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, the secret to all those trilemmas is you really have to work on all three. There isn't,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, let's just skip the quality thing. You know,
What could possibly go wrong?
yeah.
Well,
If-
some folks do make that decision.
Yeah, it's you know, and so one of the with blockchains, we talked about the sort of the decentralized, custodian-less nature of blockchains. That what we're trying to build is a kind of transaction system where the actual algorithms, the framework itself guarantees that you follow certain rules. It provides you with some guarantees, and in some cases you just have to essentially rely on incentives. Then you try to get your incentives right, because you're not actually going to be able to guarantee the outcome. Now, what happened early on in the blockchain space, like go back to 2016, 2017, when people, IBM and banks and all kind of people were actively interested in blockchain because this seemed really cool and it seemed like it was opening up a lot of possibilities. They found that it was, too expensive, too slow, wasn't scalable enough. And of course, we who got into trying to build blockchains at around that time saw that too. But being engineers, we felt that, hey, this is a really cool challenge. It's like, these are the things that we're going to have to try to solve. Staying true to the promise of what blockchain could be, but then trying to figure out how do you actually scale this. and it's amazing how many new and exciting challenges you run into as an engineer, trying to figure this. And now you have to turn your brain inside out because almost everything you knew about scaling relied on some kind of trust or cooperating agents, and just the thing about saying, well, now pretend that your peers are evil and are actually trying to break the system and steal your money. And that basically means that almost everything you knew, all the textbook solutions to building a robust, scalable system, almost all of them are out the window. You can't use them. And
That's right.
and so the control question that we often use internally is when we're discussing various ways to make it more scalable, ways to make it more fast, and is, okay, then why not just use Postgres? Now, Postgres is a very famous database system that lots of people use because it's an amazing piece of software, but it's a traditional database management system. And so if you want something fast, you want consistency, robustness, and you don't mind having a centralized solution, then just go with Postgres and be done with it.
Which is what
So-
the exchanges have done. Exactly that.
This is true.
Except
mean-
that in theory, and again, this goes back to the point of trying to understand risk. In theory, they're regulated and everything they're doing is properly auditable and so on. But only after the problem has emerged. So going back to what you were saying there, Ulf, go on, sorry.
Yeah. So actually, what a lot of people did, like for example, the exchanges in crypto space. What you actually have to do to trade on them is you have to give them your crypto
And your fiat.
Yeah.
And trust them.
Yes.
It's like, wait, what's the deal here?
and
Hold on, just a small thing here. These are not exchanges. These are centralized market makers running a book that they allow other people to participate in where it suits them to do so.
How dare you?
yeah,
Yeah,
and
sorry.
actually,
Being an ex-trader who worked on regulated proper financial service markets, I'm quite pedantic that an exchange is a multilateral trading facility in which there are multiple market makers making a price, not one pretending to be an exchange who allows some transactions to go into the sheet that aren't their own. Sorry.
Wait, you're telling me there's not always a real buyer at the other end of that trade? No way.
No, I'm telling you that the only time you'll ever get filled is if it is going against the market and the market maker is offloading risk onto your book.
How
But
dare
so,
forgive
but
my
of course,
skepticism. Truth. Go on, Ulf.
yeah, but of course, as a lot of people, actors had entered the crypto space and invested a lot of money, and the number was going up. A lot of shortcuts were taken to create what was at least a dynamic ecosystem where people could spend their money and try to make money, and basically not having to worry about solving the really, really hairy problems of how to make a really robust, secure enough, fast enough blockchain for traditional commercial
Applications. Yeah.
applications. And so we were among the few who were, kept working on that. And it wasn't exactly sexy, but it was a lot of fun. So we've spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to actually get back to what the original idea was.
The story of the
Wow,
super
the
nerds
whole
who accidentally built the real blockchain.
the whole ecosystem, whole blockchain ecosystem went bananas with digital images and hashes of them.
You don't want a monkey?
It's so disappointing. Yeah,
Yeah, but
digital monkeys. Yeah,
to your point, this is, we have a channel in our group chat that's called Weaponized Autism.
Literally called
yeah.
that too.
I went to my 30-year out school reunion quite recently, and I hated my time at school. And for various reasons, I was picked on very badly for various things like being a Catholic, sounding English. But actually, I didn't help myself because I've always had this problem of saying exactly what I think, and regardless of what anyone else might wish me not to say, because consequences, if you're a proper autist, don't really matter. You don't have a sense that they matter because you think the truth is the truth and it's the most important thing in the whole wide world. And
Yeah,
that
because the idea
actually,
that the truth would be gamed is just anathema.
correct. So the idea that something that, so if we recap, I think I know we'd all accept, but the audience, I hope, can accept this idea that everything that we do as human beings in an economic context is about managing future risk. It's about managing future risk in the context of what we want the outcome to be or what we'd like to think that the outcome could be. And ultimately, how we manage those risks bears down to the fact that we're not sole actors, that we have to take responsibility for what we do, but we also have to engage with other people in order to do anything meaningful. So how do we trust? How do we ensure that the system is honest and not being gamed? And then the next point that I would say when we go to that is to say, well, look, the existing system is simply not capable of working. It is not panoptical. It is not the all-seeing eye of Sauron. It doesn't literally see everything. It's not God. So it's never going to capture all of the pieces that are going on. Therefore, it can never have a proper sense of what the risks are. And risks that you can't define can be anything from inconsequential to utterly devastating, which is exactly what we've seen play out again and again. So our position, and I hope we've conveyed this to the audience, and I'd love to get this going where we get people asking questions around this, because I think it'd be so interesting. But the position then becomes, well, there is no alternative to having a blockchain, because it is the only way we're going to get to that possible future where, to the greatest extent possible, we can become aware of and manage accordingly the risks in terms of moment, time, locus, place, quantum amount of risk that we're undertaking. So which takes us to, so if you have to have a blockchain, how do you want it to be built? And the issue for me that and I know you guys we've all had our journeys to this point that are different, but interestingly congruent as well. So only speaking for myself here, but knowing that I'm also speaking for the others on the call. The truth that the blockchain is the one and only way that we can see where we can get to a point of trusting the message, not the messenger, securely at scale, is so important that it just can't be corrupted. You can't do it the wrong way. You can't do it in a way that creates false incentives. You can't do it in a way that just prints money or essentially just moves the deck chairs around on the Titanic. Because, for example, all of the layer 2s out there, for me, that is exactly what they're doing. They're replacing regulated payment service providers, financial service providing services with unregulated, unsupervised, everything, unhinged risk systems. I mean, for example, you've got Arbitrum, which takes 8 days to get to finality. As I joke, it was faster in the age when you had to go to the marketplace in the Roman town and the governor went to the principal for the next biggest town and had all of the ledger stamped off as being true according to the Roman Empire. That took less than 8 days, but I digress.
The Pony Express was literally faster than that.
Yeah, I digress. The thing that we're trying to say is this is too important to do wrong. It's too important to try and shortcut for short-term gain. This is something that needed to be done the right way. And us all being weirdos is how we ended up in a position where we're all saying the same thing and came together, which is it's too important to get wrong, has to be done right. And actually, between us all, we had the expertise to do it the right way. And that's the bit that I think is incredible in terms of how we've come to where we are. But to come back to what Ulf was saying, I think you were hitting on before. How do we find the best way to balance those pieces out? And it comes back to there is no one answer to every set of points. And Craig, you spoke about this brilliantly before, that human beings in everything we do things differently. You have different means of reaching consensus at the dinner table of your family home than you do in the boardroom of a company. I'll throw the pass to you at that one.
So actually on the point of taking things that are blockchains, but they're just unusably problematic from a technical perspective, but they are genuine blockchains like Bitcoin, and moving them down to layer two that's an unregulated space where you're exploding risk. It's kind of a wash, actually, because if you do go to the regulated financial space, what do you have? The regulator also controls the mint, and that's entirely at their whim. So you've only just got a different systemic risk being replaced by another localized risk, which is kind of like it's silly. Consensus. So, all right, what the thing I was going to say before about the properties of puzzles and why proof of work matters, and then compare that with which was the whole point of this call in the first book. This whole like context load we had.
But
So
context is important,
but this is our welcome to our little family. You can see our dinner table. This is gonna be funny when we get together. So the idea of proof of work. Money is an emergent property of market systems because we have unlike things traded. So I make basketballs and Greg makes cows and I want a steak. How do I pay him basketballs for like a steak, or like how do I do that? It's not a very easy.
But I don't make cows.
Maybe likes them heifers though. But you know,
I may be a complete redneck, but I do not make cows, and I do not do the thing that should not be mentioned with farm animals. Sorry, go back.
It's
Well,
funny you
unlike-
felt the urge to specify that.
Yeah, well, just like rural people often get maligned with these kind of false allegations.
Yes, you feel guilty. Okay.
what you like? Well, just remember
let's
they
get
don't
back
call
to
you.
the
They
money.
don't call you Greg the bridge builder. That
Let's get back to the
Abstract
money
reference.
discussion,
Sorry.
so we don't have to.
So Greg
Start.
makes saddles, and
Yeah.
you make basketballs.
Yeah. So saddles and basketballs. Trading these two things together is a very high impedance trade. It's not easy to figure out how many saddles a basketball's worth and vice versa. And if I've already got a saddle, I don't need two, etc. So how do we do this trade? A third thing will come in. This will always emerge. The community of people that are trading will always wind up picking something that is of common value, is easily fungible, is readily exchanged, easy to divide up. It might be rice, it might be wheat, it might be tobacco leaves, it might be bullets, could be anything. It's very often, not always, but very often in history, it's settled back down to gold because gold is like super hard to fake. The reason gold's super hard to fake, despite alchemical efforts to the contrary, you have to blow up a star to make some. And that's really hard to do. No one's figured out how to do it on purpose yet. So making
Elon's
gold
working on it.
yeah, right. So even Elon has not yet cracked the nut on gold, but there is actually a hint in what Ulf just said that is true that would upset gold completely also. The problem is that to get gold, you have to expend a huge amount of effort to get at it, to transport it, to sometimes convert it into a form that's accepted as currency because it may be a known weight or something like that, or known weight or purity or whatever. So gold is a very useful form of money. It's been used as money, like not all through history, but for quite a lot of it. And it's still useful as money today. However, gold also has a commodity use. And the commodity use is such that if the money use of gold makes gold so expensive, like outrageously expensive, you won't be able to make computer chips because gold is an industrial input to things like computer chips. So, well, that's weird. So gold's actually a industrial commodity and its money, yes, both are true. The money use of gold has outweighed the commercial application of gold,
Yeah,
such that it's actually
hence,
in.
I would argue that gold has an industrial utilization, and the value of that utilization is the point at which a solution can be found that obviates the need for gold.
To some degree, there's so that you still have the trust problem though.
Bear with me. So therefore, the differential between the utilization value, as in the price at which gold can be replaced in an industrial process, versus the price it is today, that is the premium that we place upon it as being a store of value and or money.
Correct. Yes. So the money so you've got what you basically have is you have a commodity that's got two utility uses. And the problem is that these are two highly incongruent commodity uses, utility uses, and one you can't really replace one with the other. But one of them, whichever the higher value is the market that gold's going to drift towards, which is going to elevate the cost of using it in whatever the other utility is. So imagine if, for example, the only way to make gas for your car was corn, but corn's also your main staple food. Well, now you got a problem because there's no replacement for either one, but people got to eat. They're
Yeah,
going to eat.
which is the argument people have been making against the use of ethanol as a replacement for petroleum, because it means that you are doing something to make energy rather than make food with the same thing.
Right. And in a
And
different
again,
sense, that
with
food is energy.
biofuel now.
Yeah,
So-
that's exactly it. That's the
Right.
that's the point with the biofuels, ethanol. The complaint from the greenies is that, well, you're going to cut out the food now.
Right. And there's
Mhm.
so the thing is all these are true at the same time, and that makes it difficult to pick what to use as money once you get to the point where your economy is making computer chips instead of just using gold as money. As far as the trust value of gold, that's the point at which you can't assail gold as money. Is you can't say, well, but I can't trust gold. Like, no, you totally can trust gold. Like, if I give you some gold, you could, and then like you check that that's gold, like that's fucking gold. Like, you can't fake that. So the problem that you do get though is that every so often, somewhere in the world, we find a gold vein that is super easy to get to and has a ton of gold in it, and you have the California gold rush. And the problem that you get there is that you pulled so much gold out of the ground in California. Now, you've got it in the ground in California. You pulled it out of the ground over there, transported all the way across the world, and put it back in the ground somewhere else, just in like brick form. And it didn't feed anybody. A lot of work went into this, but it didn't feed anybody. And it also massively, and it like doubled the supply of gold.
Look,
That was so-
this is one of the big flaws with the whole gold argument is we don't actually know how much gold there is, and if someone were to suddenly find, to your point, a massive seam of it, it would destabilize everything else, which is to the point that Ulf was touching on and you hinted at, is exactly what dear Mr. Musk is trying to do when he gets things to go out into space and start mining asteroid fields and other planets. Because all of a sudden
Right.
the equation changes, and the work that he is engaged in, the billions, if not trillions, that he has spent to get to the point where he can do this is precisely so that he can bring valuable commodities back to the earth. But
Right. But that tips up the commodity market. Like the first time that we get a trillion ton asteroid that we bring into Earth orbit that's made mostly out of gold, like that, the gold market's done. It's nothing but making computer
look,
chips now.
I want to come back to this because there's something that I've been working on in the past that we call the Da Vinci Protocol, which we'll come to. And one of the ideas of the Da Vinci Protocol is that actually there is no finite number of tokens that are created. It's created by market demand. And that's fine in most contexts. And the thing that won the argument in my head that we were having around what we make the Gaju was actually this point that we're now touching on, which is, well, what happens if an unknown occurs at some point in the future that is so huge that it changes everything? Now, in the context of a single idea, you know, the Da Vinci Protocol is about capitalizing and commercializing intellectual and creative property. But we're talking about something that values everything, that is the metric by which everything else can work. You really have to be so aware of that. You could call it a black swan event, but it's the Elon Musk event. He actually does crack how to commercialize the extraction of minerals from Mars. And that changes everything, because unless you have a finite number that can ever be produced and total knowledge of how you get there, you have this issue that all of a sudden something can be injected, like the California gold rush, like the extraction of minerals from space, that
Like
transforms our
crypto
markets.
airdrops.
Well, crypto
No,
airdrops are
but that's a
different.
different version of the
Crypto
problem.
airdrops are very different. What crypto airdrops is, and I think they're incredible for this. There is nothing else anywhere in the world that is so good at sending this signal. We have something worth absolutely nothing. That's why we're giving it away for free in an airdrop to get people to think that it might have some value, and it's a complete fallacy.
Oh yeah.
But welcome to the game. You know, welcome to being the bag holders that we're going to point at as being our community for the venture capitalists who will fund us dumping that number on you. Anyway, forgive me.
Yeah. And
Go back to what you were saying.
hang on, chat. Let me go ahead and announce an airdrop real quick. That's the silliest thing.
So we've
Anyways.
now given away the fact that we're not going to be doing airdrops. But
Well, actually, yes, that's true. We have a whole different way that we're trying to get to distribute. So airdrops are trying to solve the problem of distribution. If nobody has the currency to start with, how do you bootstrap an economy? That won't fit into this discussion, but we do have
That's a huge topic for another day.
it's a really cool topic too.
Yeah.
But we don't have time for it here. Anyway, so this idea of how do I trust a thing? Well, you got to blow up a star to make gold. That's pretty good promise that it's not faked. But you do have the problem that you don't know where the gold is, so you might just walk into a room full of it in a cave somewhere and be like, well, okay, the gold, I better not tell anyone about this because that's going to
Yeah.
really screw
Yeah,
things up.
sorry, to sort of make a small joke about this. People always talked about that joke about, you know, if you owe the bank $1 million, you're in trouble. If you owe the bank $1 billion, the bank's in trouble. It's a little bit like
Mhm.
that, because if you walked into a cave, to your analogy, and you found 100 kilograms of gold, you're rich. If you walked
Mhm.
into a cave and found 1 billion kilograms of gold, you might not be, because actually
Yeah,
you've destabilized the entire value, the supply.
yeah, like
of
there's going to
the
be a
thing.
couple of wars. 2 decades from now, there's going to be wars over this because some kind of imbalance is going to occur that's so big that nobody knows where the tail is going to wind up at. And there will be fights over that because that's the kind of thing people do fight about. It's not because they're greedy. It's because they're trying to manage risk. And you unbutton all of the caps on risk at that point. So you're just going to have to fight it out because that's how you find trust in the first place is mutual capacity for violence. That's an Intrabis point, different video on that too. But anyway, the idea here that we're sort of establishing is that
Just to put a
money is an
marker on
emergent
this,
property.
This is a
Sorry?
video that we will definitely do on why the world is going to go to war at
Mhm.
some point, but it's another thing. And actually, we have an internal joke that our object is to get to the Glorious Revolution, which is where there was effectively a massive change in the government of the United Kingdom, which led to so many of the ideas of liberty, capitalism, and so on, versus the 1917 version, where there's a massive bloodletting and people are being machine gunned in the streets. But
yeah, let's not do
back to
that
Craig.
or the
That's a-
1870s or let's go the short one, not the
Yeah.
bad one. So the way we get to the short one is this. Well, hopefully we get to the short one. Is we need an off valve. We need an off pressure valve because money systems are super unbalanced because we haven't actually agreed on gold. They ditched that because they're dumb. And well, that I said it. So
well, no, they ditched it because they're smart, and the rest of us are dumb.
that's a different way of looking at it. So the downfall of the foxes as opposed to the lions, right? The downfall of the foxes is that they forget. This is the problem with the Chinese. Okay, let me reset this. There's the Tokyo millionaire and there is the Beijing billionaire. And the problem, now you go like, oh, billionaire. So Beijing billionaire, that's better. That's who I want to be. I want to be the guy with a big number. Here's the problem. You have to live in Beijing where like people make gutter oil and everything sucks and the government just shuts you down, disappear you like Jack Ma, rewire your shit and come back. Like that is Beijing. That's a totally, remember, we work together to mitigate uncertainty going forward. And all the CCP does is sit up as this giant Damocles sword of absolute uncertainty over everybody, even the billionaires. So yeah, go ahead, live your glitzy life in Beijing, but that could come to a screeching halt at any second. On the other hand, if you are a millionaire, just a millionaire, living in Tokyo, man, your quality of life is like way better than that dude. And you've got way more assurances. You have more freedom of action. You can plan for things that that guy can never plan for. He's going to do flippant spending. He's going to learn how to drive one day and then buy a Benz the next and crash it, which is exactly what happens. So in Beijing, like every day, absolute unreliability over there, pretty good reliability over here. So this is the Beijing billionaire versus the Tokyo millionaire problem. And this is the problem with a sort of what should be an aristocratic class that's exposed to violence and goes through a horrible, grueling selection process to arrive at the sort of elite status in society to make decisions about things. When they're all just a fake elite and they don't believe in consequences anymore, and they're like, everyone's dumb, I'm not as dumb, so I'm going to cheat them. They don't realize they are rug pulling themselves, and they're making themselves into the Beijing billionaire. That's don't do that, kids. So back to how do we decide what money is?
Well,
Because
before we get there, because this is a really important point, and it's definitely something that we'll talk about in a lot more depth in time. So the same person who told me that Bitcoin was something that should get 70% interest on it for lending it to other people did say something interesting that didn't make me laugh, which was that paper money was a layer 2 for gold. So the discussion had been that I rejected the idea of layer 2s. I said, look, fundamentally, Bitcoin is a proof of concept that can never evolve beyond being a proof of concept. It's a wonderful one. It's why we're all here.
Mm-hmm.
But to bastardize it with layer 2s is to corrupt it completely. And it's a little bit like saying Bitcoin is somebody put a square wheel on an axle and then wondered why the cart didn't move very easily without a great deal of force. And our approach is to say, well, actually, the wheel is the problem. It's a square. It should be a circle. We'll put a circle on instead. And what's happened is layer 2s are effectively a bunch of people trying to add to or chisel from the square to make it more like a polygon, pun intended. And
even worse, they're trying to rebuild every road into a series of arcs so it'll roll.
yeah.
And
But the point about our paper money being a layer 2 for gold was a really interesting one, and I thought it was a fantastic expression, because the more I thought on it, the more I thought it really was. It was a fungible means of transacting in something where the promise at the bottom of the pound note, I don't know about the American version, but the pound note used to say that the Bank of England promises to pay the bearer the value of. Now, it will do it today. It still says that today, and I don't know what they're going to exchange it for, because you could start to say "and" to everything. I mean, for example, they might say, well, we'll give you some bonds denominated in what currency? Pound. Okay, that's a problem. Denominated in dollars? That's a problem. Because in order to pursue this greater greed, to become the Beijing billionaire, to build upon the point that you were making, a cabal of people decided that it was better to go to fiat money that we can literally just print and magic out of thin air. And I appreciate for any of the financial service people and or monetary economists watching, that is an egregious comment that will wind you up and get your knickers in a twist. But if you distill all of the smart arguments you're going to make, that is what it is. And you just keep it to the very prosaic and simple. That is what it boils down to. What we've done is we've created an economy that was the Tokyo millionaire, turned it into the Beijing billionaire so that we can all think that we're richer, but actually we're infinitely poorer because the risks that we're taking are infinitely greater than they were.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're rug pulling ourselves.
Absolutely. So this is the point that I think I was making when we started into this piece of the conversation, where I said, you said smart people. I forget what else you said exactly. You said something like,
those people are dumb. I'm
Yes.
not
Yes,
as
I
dumb.
said no. We're the stupid ones because we let
Yeah.
the smart but bad people, well, bad people, smart but misguided people. Because I don't think everybody is bad in this at all.
Well, there's a lot of sly people out there, though.
Yeah, but Hillary Clinton will die soon, so life is good. Anyway, so
Oh, wow.
yeah.
Well, I mean, so
To whoever is watching, we are not pulling any
No,
punches.
So one of my
I'm not
pet
advocating
peeves
that
has
anybody should
always
assassinate Hillary Clinton either. I'm just saying that in 2016, I did feel like we had a choice between the steroidal Oompa Loompa and the Wicked Witch.
Just like to say, if I don't wake up tomorrow, I had no intention of committing suicide. I'm a happy dude, having a good time, and I also have no information about defects in Boeing products.
Anyway, let's go.
You're a goner.
well, I mean, the
Well,
whole
for
thing
goodness sake.
about my take on or my vector into politics was essentially that I spent my career trying to architect really complex orchestration systems in software, and it's very, very obvious that there is a complexity ceiling, and beyond that, you're basically just dealing with probabilities, and the only way to get it to actually work is you have to partition the problem. You have to sort of break it down into small pieces that have fairly clear protocols of communication between each other. And you have to accept, like Craig was talking about before, that there is just no way of dealing with the entire complexity. If you try to manage the entire complexity and control it, you're going to fail. And these software systems, complex as they are absolutely nothing compared to a human society.
Mhm.
And of course, we've seen over and over again that economic systems that try for totalitarian control, where you try to top down regulate everything, are going to fail miserably. They're going to lead to disaster because, well, for one thing, you lose your control, or you eventually realize you never had one. You never had control. Thomas Sowell had one example in his Basic Economics about, what was it, Sobel pelts in the Soviet Union. They were priced too high. So hunters were just basically killing all the Sobel that they could come across, and selling it to the agreed upon price, but there were no buyers because the supply of Sobel pelts widely outstripped the demand. So they had store warehouses where they were just piling Sobel pelts that were rotting because they couldn't sell them. And so they pushed this back to the central pricing committee, but they had like 2 million other products that they needed to set the prices on. And so it took several years before they got around to adjusting the price of Sobel. And this is what happens. And typically what happens is, and people still think that, well, yeah, they didn't get it quite right, but I and my friends are going to get it right when we get the chance to do this. And this is the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. You just keep chasing it, because if we just line everything up completely correctly, we're going to be able to do this that nobody else has been able
it's
to
the
do.
illusion of vanity that
And-
is plaguing humanity through to today.
And what
But-
happens is, very competent people, and of course, this is another thing, was that, who was it that talked about that? That one of the brilliant things about capitalism is that you actually employ so many more brains and give them a more limited scope. Like, I have a reasonably good grip of my own family's economy. Maybe not as good as I should have, but at least better than just about anybody else. And so I can actually make decisions in my sphere of influence. If I keep my sphere of influence reasonably limited, then my brain can be roughly adequate to the task.
Oh, this touches on a whole slew of like interest points, one of them being where moral imposition and consciousness spectrum match. How that confers moral importance, starting with the fungal colony all the way up to animals. You expect more moral behavior out of a chimp than a dog, more out of a dog than a slug or whatever. But it peaks at a human individual because you know everything about you. Well, you don't really, because we're trying to discover ourselves all the time. But the best person you're ever going to know the most about is you, typically.
And
You know a good bit about your family, but that's consciousness declining again. And then the village, the state, then your nation, and then humanity. And you're back down to a fungal colony's level of moral imposition because you're back down to a fungal colony's degree of consciousness as well, which is why you can't. This is a wacky political trick where we try to project individual morality onto a state, individual morality onto a nation, individual morality onto a company. You can't do that because they're going to behave in this animistic way for its own survival, just like you have over here with a colony of rats. You don't expect moral behavior out of them because they're going to do what they do to survive. And if they don't do those things, they're going to perish. There's a hard selection filter there. It's an operation over here too.
And also, of course, we rely on other people's goodwill to be able to make our own puzzle come together. And this is where it becomes so important to try to limit your sphere of influence and try to control your life or build your life on pieces that you actually have some control over, and with people who are actually willing to cooperate with your scheme because it aligns with theirs. And,
we're right back to Marcus Aurelius, by the way.
But when you reach for too much, then suddenly you need to whip people into submission to get them to play along in your particular scheme. And it turns out that most people are as unwilling to do that as you would be if the shoe was on the other foot. And so then that's when it resorts, or where it basically boils down to violence. That you try to launch this wonderful scheme, which secretly relies on actually changing the way other people think, because their priorities are screwed up because they don't align with yours. And when they don't want to play, this is the game theory problem that what's his name mentioned about communism, Weinstein, that it was that people, when your system depends on the people who are capable working their butts off to support the people who are not, the people who are capable look at this and say, what's in it for me? It seems like a really bad deal for me. I'm going to work really hard and somebody else is going to reap the profits. So the best thing for me seems to be not to play. And then when people start making that decision independently, then that's when you realize you have to force them, because without their cooperation, it doesn't work. And suddenly you descend into violence quickly, because you have made a bunch of assumptions about how other people are going to act that they did not agree to, and they will not agree to, because you're not providing an incentive structure that actually works for them. But if people can find their own incentive structure, then they can actually go about their lives and be happy and interact with you in win-win situations, and also perhaps build cultures where you can have a fairly high degree of trust within your local ecosystem. But what you have to have is clear rules for how to play the game.
It gets worse too. If once you violate that trust the first time and try to force people to do something, and then you pull back from that and say, but just come on, their incentive now is just to not do whatever you say.
As
Just
everyone
people
who's
who
been in a
agree with that.
relationship knows.
Yeah, exactly. Like, there's some lines you shouldn't cross, and breaking trust is one of them. try to not do that.
And
So-
so this kind of gets back to what actually was the original promise with blockchain, and that still is a possibility that
Mhm.
we actually can set up a framework of rules that could actually apply universally, partly because they are so limited and they are so well defined that you can actually work with them. They're not going to eliminate risk, but at least it can help you quantify the risks. And
Right.
and,
We can eliminate one version of risk that's coming from
Yes.
out of context, which is the debasement of money. And
Yes,
Mhm.
and
That's-
changing of rules
Yeah,
on the go.
yeah, and changing of rules out of nowhere.
Ultimately, what we're talking about here, and Ulf really brought this point in, and it's the unspoken thing so far, but I think it needs to be spoken of. This is deeply political. Everything that we're doing, it's not technological. It's deeply political. What we're enabling is a political future that we believe in, ultimately. We may see it as being the truth and the only truth, but other people may be opposed to that for all sorts of reasons. Have a debate with a socialist anytime, and they'll tell you that it's unfair that somebody has more money than them. And I'll say, well, hold on. How do you know that that's unfair? What are the inputs that led to the equation that gave you the answer? And ultimately, we live in a world today. Even my old university, University College London, had this missive go out to all of the alumni talking about how there happened to be some people protesting against Israel and for Palestine in what is meant to be one of the world's leading universities, and that we should have respect for their feelings. No, we shouldn't. Your feelings are yours. How you arrived at your feelings is your problem. It's not mine. It's not anyone else's. Facts are
Mhm.
facts. And facts really don't care about your feelings. Your feelings is something that you need to deal with. Go back to that Socratic principle. But we do have this friction between those who would create an artifice and create a centralized body to establish and enforce that artifice, which is the socialist approach, versus those of us who would say, but actually, what we really want to do, and the language has been plain for all of the years that I've been doing this. I talk about the economic emancipation of humanity. That is the object of the Internal of Economics. The Gajumaru is the foundational building block upon which you can make that happen.
so one of the
But at
things
its
you, of
heart
course,
sits the
learn
idea
as
of equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome. And that is it shouldn't be a political statement because it should be an obvious truth, but it is a political statement. And Ulf was right in saying
That presupposes that someone believes in truth rather than feelings, though. And that's the basic divide that goes all the way back to the roots of philosophy. Is, do you believe there's a world or that there's not a world?
great
And
point.
there's a fundamental incongruency here where there's certain people that will say, I feel that. So there's a certain type of personality that has feelings about an issue. There's another type of personality that has thoughts about an issue. They are not the same, and they're not going to meet in the middle. They can coexist, but the feelings-based thought process is all focused on the inside. And I'm saying the inside, there's an inner and there's an outer to everything. There's an inner and there's an outer to the family. And mom is a commissar and dad's Stalin. And it's a commune. Hey, we're all communists, sort of. And there is reappropriation stuff rampantly inside of a family, but that's because you know everybody. They're not statistics. They got a name. They got a history. They're your kid or whatever. That's a different relationship from the state. If you try to, this goes back to that the false elite and the trust problem that occurs where you get perverted incentives when you stop knowing who the councilman is because he lives down the road from you, and you wind up becoming this abstract number instead of somebody with a name. When you are somebody with a name, and this is exactly the thing I was saying about the consciousness spectrum, where it peaks at the individual and the next step over the hump is the family. In that, you do have an inner, and it is a lot about feelings. It's not purely cold-blooded calculate. You don't think, how many minutes have I given to this boy today? It's like, well, this one's like me, and she sounds like that because I like this a little bit more.
To the point you're making here, this is where I think the magic of Stoicism steps in. And it's not to be the terribly stiff upper lip old chap, the thing from Monty Python where the knight says, "'Tis but a scratch." That isn't
Mhm.
what I mean by stoicism. Stoicism actually is about understanding that your feelings are yours, the master of your feelings is you, and
But this is
actually
outward.
you can make choices. No, it's inward. The outward pieces are what impact the inward, but the choice of what you feel is yours. Whether even if, and look, I've been here, even if you go through the darkest periods,
Mhm.
your feeling of darkness is yours. You can choose to feel differently. It's really damn hard, but you
Yes.
can.
My point is that this is a strategy for coping with the outer.
sure.
And because the outer is going to hit you with uncertainty, and the inner is the only place you can try to have some.
Is understanding that you can't control the outside world. You can only control the
Yes.
internal. Okay.
Mhm.
And you're right. So much of what we see in a highly entitled world is one in which everybody thinks that the only feelings that actually matter are theirs. And they are
Right.
projecting their consciousness, their feelings onto as somebody. And somebody invariably is the state, in effect. Somebody should do something about this. Why? Because I'm outraged. Okay.
Yeah.
And ultimately, you end up with a really corrupted, destroyed system, which is where we are in so many ways today. But look, coming back to the point that Ulf raised, and it's true, and we shouldn't run away from it. A lot of what we're talking about is political. It shouldn't be political, but it is.
Mhm.
And it's around these ideas of, well, what sits at the heart of Western civilization? The idea of liberty, the idea that you are free to do that which you wish, so long as you don't impact upon the liberty of others. All of these points are actually at the core of what our ideas come to.
Well, there's a point also at which Western.
And so we're clear. I'm skating really high level, like not the 50,000 view. I'm kind of at U2 120,000 foot.
So I would
territory here,
argue that I don't know,
deliberately.
maybe a sort of an engineering take. Certainly, what we've seen in with the development of social media is we had a lot of engineers that had a tremendous amount of fun and created something that probably horrified many of them in retrospect.
So my kids aren't on it.
And so from an engineering point of view, and again, the weaponized autism here, we're trying to build something that works based on how we perceive the world as working. But it's also, there is this existential dimension that we actually want to build something that we think will have positive effects on the world and not make things worse. Because obviously, I think it's hard to be a programmer at scale, sort of trying to attack global problems without seeing some of the very obvious risks. Like, hey, I mean, the people who designed or came up with Instagram weren't evil. They probably didn't quite get the mindset of a 13-year-old girl, though, and had no idea what dynamic they were gonna feed and accelerate to the point where they would almost traumatize a generation or generations of young girls.
Mhm.
And this is, of course, always the risk when we're trying to build something that is essentially globally scalable, that
Mhm.
and where incentives play such a big role.
But
And
is that
so part of being political about this is we need to try to explain what our reasoning is. And if people think that we are wrong and that some of the things we aim to set in motion will actually set fire to the world, then yeah, personally, I would like to know it.
Look, I think,
Good
I think
point.
this goes to the root of something that we've said in a number of the videos before now, and I've definitely said in posts and discussions with people, is that and it's a test for whether something is a blockchain or not as well, at a very prosaic level, which is, what's the business model? If you're building a blockchain, what's your business model? And from the get-go, ours was not to be a blockchain.
Hmm.
Ours was to put a blockchain into the market that would allow us to build the things that we believe are necessary on top of that. Because at the moment, there's nothing in the market that can actually sustain what needs to come next. As we all saw it. So,
The root of
At
all
the heart-
frustrations.
yeah, but at the heart of what we're trying to do with the Gajumaru is put a resource layer, and we'll come to resource infrastructure platform application as a way of seeing the world in another video, another time. But we want to put this resource layer that everybody owns, that's open to everybody, that nobody can control into the world, because once that exists, it exists, and it is controlled by nobody. Nobody can dictate what it will or will not do. Nobody can say, we will make the Gajumaru shut down payments to anybody whose last name has an OV in it.
Oh no.
Yeah. I love the fact that your name popped up as you said, oh no, but you know, this is what's happened with the sanctions. We have undermined trust in the existing financial system, if indeed anybody could say that it should be trusted after all that we have learned and the things that we've touched on in this conversation. The idea that they are a resource for all has been clearly unpicked by what happened in the sanctions on Iran, the sanctions on Russia, and it doesn't matter whether you agree with them or not. That's neither here nor there. Either something is a common resource, it's a common good, or it isn't. And if it isn't, somebody is controlling it. And this is where we get back to these same problems all over again. So actually,
You also end up with discovered capacity informing intent. So they've done this once and they go, hey, that was useful that one time. And we kind of skated over it. Well, now we'll lower the bar for doing it again and again and again. Pretty soon, you're just in arbitrary land.
It's the same thing that I talk about. It's the broken seal issue. Once a man hits a woman, he will always hit a woman. Unless, of course, what happens to that man is he hits somebody that's related to me, and somebody else who's related to me throws that person through a second-story window, in which case, no, they will not hit a woman again, because the result of hitting a woman one time was a lifetime of debilitation.
Right.
So, but the thing is, we haven't done that in what's happened in the world today.
No, we've rewarded it.
Yes, we've rewarded it, and that is exactly what we're leading to, is this tumble down situation where it worked then, let's do it again. It's easier because it's a broken seal. The thou shalt not.
You even get
years.
state agencies built around whatever that mechanism is that you have to use, and if you don't use it, they erode, and there's a manpower and allocations aspect to that. So it's, once you've created an organization, just that constitution inspection thing comes back again. It's a fungal colony, and it will try to survive. That's its primary, whatever your mission statement in the organization is. The unspoken mission zero that they all have is to continue to survive. And once you've created that state apparatus to do weird things with money, that organization is not going to disband on its own. You have to come from outside of the wrecking ball and get rid of it. That thing's going to try to survive, and it's going to keep making up justifications for why it needs to be exercised and expanded. And that's what's happening right now. That's the whole CBDC thing.
It will use the language of emotion to convey that argument.
It'll use the flexible we. We should do this. And sometimes they mean we. They say we should do this. They mean society. Then other times they say we, and they really mean like you should do something.
And good and competent people will be doing this. That's a scary thing.
No, it is.
It is really the scary thing.
As good and competent people built Instagram.
Yeah, well, look, let's get back to the topic, because we could literally spend all day doing this.
I think we almost have.
So
let me get this part.
Let
me get this part into the YouTube transcript thing so that we have a section title for this, because it'll come out. Let me define we've defined that we've identified that money's an emergent property of market systems. Unlike things being traded, you need some common medium we all agree on. Gold's been pretty effective because you can't fake it. You just can't. But you got the problem that you could just run into a bunch of gold in a cave somewhere and upset the whole global economy. That's terrifying. So how do we have a basis for money that is protected by the same exact the roots of the universal asymmetry that defines physics for us? That uncertainty is a forward thing, but we can see backwards. How can we use that, leverage that, to create a system where we can have a finite number of tradable, fungible things that are useful as money, but have that fixed, they're protected by the laws of uncertainty that define our rules for this particular universe that we're in. That's actually what cryptography, that's why cryptography plays into this. Because cryptography is all about this. I'm not going to be mathematical about it. Just in an ideal situation, you have an effectively limitless number of possibilities. Only one of them is true. And you can only see that one way. You can't go back the other way and get a hold of it. And that's, of course, in the ideal case. There's some other things we can talk about in other videos, but you have this forward uncertainty. And so we started this discussion out about consensus, that there's proof of work and there's proof of stake. And what we really should establish, so that we need to establish this so we can reference it in later conversations, is why is proof of work so important as the trustless, and when I say trustless, I mean we don't have to trust anybody in the network, and because we don't have to trust them, they can be anonymous. You have to not trust them for them to be anonymous. That's a very important rule that will come up in proof of stake discussions. And we have to have this other thing where, just as in the ledger problem, who gets to update the ledger? The guy who was the clergy before he gives up his future life, can't be married, can't have kids. He's part of the clergy. That's why he gets to write the ledger down for the village. And so we trust that, because that's like the ultimate cost signal for a man, is to give up your future in that way. So that's his cost signal that he's given. So we trust that. He can't fake that very easily. So what's the cost signal that we've got for trusting who is the leader within an anonymous set of nodes that all potentially could become the leader? And when I say become the leader, I mean the one that's allowed to update the ledger for this particular generation of transactions. We use a cryptographic puzzle for that, which means the puzzle that you pick, there's any number of puzzles you could come up with mathematically for this, but the puzzle is going to have a couple of properties. And a very, very important one is that the puzzle is going to have to be really hard to solve, but it's going to have to, so expensive to solve. And then it's going to have to be super easy to check. So very hard to solve. Going to take you a lot of time to solve the puzzle, a lot of effort. But then checking the puzzle.
Where is Waldo? Where is Waldo? There is a hidden Waldo somewhere. You have to find Waldo, but it's really easy to prove where is Waldo once you have found him.
Yeah, perfect example. Yeah. So just imagine. Actually, I'm going to use that because I normally use the example of a jigsaw puzzle, but this is great. So another property that you've got that's useful for this type of system where you don't know how many people are going to be competing. You don't know how many. So in this case, miners, right? You don't know how many proof of work miners are going to be in the system. So the puzzle needs to be of variable difficulty, right? Because let's just say that the way we're going to look for Waldo, everyone's going to use the same method. They're going to go from here and just look through the page until they can find Waldo, point him out and go, hey, I found him here. Now, how big is that page and how detailed is it? What's the resolution of the page, and how large is the page is going to give you how hard it's going to be to figure out where Waldo is using this technique. But everyone's going to use the same technique. They could start anywhere they want to in it, but they all got to check the page to try to find Waldo. Now, once they found him, it's completely unambiguous, and they can prove it to anybody really, really easy, right? So imagine you've got a room of 10 kids, all at desks, and there's a huge stack of Where's Waldo books, or basically puzzles, right? Where's Waldo puzzles. and they're in graduated difficulty. So the kids can pick how difficult the one they want to try to solve is. So they all pick their puzzle and they're sitting at their desks and they're trying to find Waldo. Now, one of the kids goes, found him, gets up in front of class, says he's right there. And everyone can just look at that and go, dude, that's totally, yep, that's Waldo. So you're the guy now. And at that moment, everyone's got to toss their puzzles, get a new one, and get going to find this again. But until the next kid finds Waldo again, until the next kid finds Waldo in his puzzle, the kid that just found Waldo, this is his proof that he's the leader for now. And everyone has seen that and goes, yep, that's you're the leader. Now what he does is he goes to the desk at the front of the class, and there's a big stack, there's an inbox. It's all these transactions people have put in. You know, I want to send money to Greg, I want to send money to Ulf. Dimitar's super nice guy, so he's going to send tons of money to me, of course. And this kid is now sitting there with the ledger, and he's picking out transactions that he's going to update the ledger with. And once he's done with them, he doesn't need the transaction anymore. Now it's stored in memory, but there's like an outbox, so this is processed. He puts them over here. But they're in the ledger now. And so the ledger's balances have all updated to take account of what activity happened on the chain. Suddenly, another kid found Waldo in his puzzle, gets up and says, hey, found him. Everyone goes, yep, that's it. So he comes and replaces this kid. This kid goes back and sits down. Now, the act of having found Waldo awards me a certain number of new Gajus that have never yet existed. So they're being created. I'm being awarded that within the ledger as a property of having found Waldo, and circling Waldo on the page and putting that into the ledger book is my proof of having had been the leader at that time. And that's basically my receipt for I have received this many Gajus because I solved that puzzle at this height at this stage of the book, at this stage of the ledger's existence. Finding Waldo is worth this many Gajus that are new, and they're now put under my name in the ledger book, and we all agree on that. That's the system. Those are the rules by which we are playing. Now, it doesn't matter how the teacher set this game up, and it doesn't matter how big the book is so far, how long the ledger is so far. The rules were established at the outset, and the teacher may have set up the room, set up this puzzle game, but the teacher can't know which kid is going to find Waldo where or when or at what difficulty. That's going to be a consequence of it's effectively random. And that's the whole point of mining. Now, the more kids you put in to this class, let's say we had 10 before in this example, let's put 10,000. Now we're going to have some contention where it's going to be quite common that two kids find Waldo at the same time. This is where the difficulty thing comes in. The kid whose puzzle is the more difficult one, he wins out. And everybody can see that that's true at that moment. So that's where the difficulty matters. And that's why the more kids you have, the more likely you are to get these like sudden, I found him, but I found him on a weak puzzle. So it's in your interest as a puzzle solver to pick a puzzle that's equal or slightly more difficult than what everybody else is doing. And so it's an arms race, basically, that the more search power there is throughout the group, the more likely it is to have somebody pop up with, hey, found, like, just glance at the page, dude, he's right there because you got lucky. And that's essentially what this is it's a luck game. The guy who found him on the harder puzzle wins. So picking an easy puzzle to win first doesn't actually get you anywhere. So the more miners you have, the more difficult things get. The fewer miners you have, the easier it gets to find stuff. Now, where this comes into play is, as we discussed before, there's the CAP theorem. And CAP was consistency. We all agree on what the ledger says. Availability, it's a very responsive system. And the P, this is a really important one. The P here is partition tolerance. That means that if, so I live in southern Japan. We're subject to earthquakes. If an earthquake cuts the sea cable, my network just is done. We're not talking to anybody until that gets fixed. So at that moment, my network becomes just very local to me, which means that suddenly the miners here on this fork are just talking to each other, and the puzzles get really, really easy real quick. Because if I pick a simple puzzle and I solve it real quick, everyone working on these ultra hard puzzles, because they were competing with the whole world, they won't find they won't find Waldo for like an hour, and I just found him now. So I'm going to be the leader because they can't before the next generation time lapses, or basically another kid catches on that solving the easier puzzles a way to go. That's going to force the difficulty back down to being much, much easier because now you're back down to 100 kids instead of 10,000 globally, right? So our little fragment of the network continues on, but we're going off on a fork now. The rest of the world, though, didn't even notice that these 100 kids got kicked off the network because there's tens of thousands of them worldwide. So they're continuing on, basically didn't even notice that, Southern Japan got kicked off the network. So they continue doing what they're doing. And that is the majority of the network. And it completely is fine that Southern Japan dropped off. Eventually, this undersea cable gets fixed. We rejoin the network. And going back to now you got the problem. You've mined a few generations over here by yourself off on your own fork. This fork is massively harder, which means that there's been a mistake somewhere. So when these messages about height come from the big network to this one, they'll be like, we have provably massively harder puzzles solved than you do on your fork. So yours is obviously wrong. So this chain is going to take the transactions that have been mined on it, pull them out, throw them back into the mempool. They're valid transactions. They got mined. So they will get mined ultimately on the big chain. But we're going to backtrack and rejoin the big chain, having taken what was mined, thrown it back into the mempool, and they will all be mined again. So if on the side chain that was on the fork, that the partition that was tiny, local to me, I had sent money to Ulf, that transaction happened then. When we rejoin the big chain, those go back into the mempool. Me sending money to Ulf will now have happened in the bigger world again. So nothing effectively changed about what would have happened with the transactions. There can be ordering issues that can mess things up, but the point of this discussion is that we are getting partition tolerance, but we're getting it at somewhat of an expensive availability in the sense that there's going to be a multi-minute delay. And consistency at that moment, we have partition tolerance, but consistency is not maintained during the partition. So I'm getting wrong answers sort of over here on this fork for the moment, and I'm not seeing the bigger updates in the world, but it's still working. When we rejoin, this is what Ulf was saying before, is that partition robustness to network partitions is not a solvable problem in the base case. You have to decide what's important about recovering a universal state and coming back to agreement that's consistency. So you're trying to get back to consistency and maintaining availability for the bigger net over there. That's important because you can't just shut down the financial system because one island got bumped off temporarily, right? So availability of the system is still maintained generally. There's a delay for this fragment of the network as it rejoins because those transactions have to get booted back out to the mempool and work back in again. But it is a self-healing system that's self-healing in a way that nobody has to go in. So because there's nobody who can centrally control the network, we don't have the authority. Even if we deploy the Gajimaru, we deploy them, we give the software to everybody, we wrote the software. We have no ability whatsoever. Exactly like Bitcoin. We have no ability whatsoever to go in and hand edit the ledger and force a merger to happen and like that. You can't happen. So there's a self-healing mechanism to proof of work. And that is incredibly important because you don't have a central authority that can decide, oh, your puzzle's not good enough, we're going to kick that out, give your gadgets to this other guy and whatever, because now you're picking and choosing. You've just reinvented the Federal Reserve. You're pretending you've given people a bunch of rules that you say you're going to play by, but you have the authority to violate them yourself. That's wrong. That's not a foundation that you can rely on because that would allow you to do things like break the financial system because there's an inconvenient war in East Europe, like right now. It's not going to matter over the next 500 years. It matters right now, but you're going to throw out the financial system for the next 500 years over this thing, which undermines the financial system and it guarantees a bigger war later. Because as we established earlier in this conversation, the whole idea of trust signals and working together amongst humans is about mitigating risk. And you introduce this mega risk.
But this is the story of Adam and Eve and the apple. This is precisely it, is that
Mhm.
If you take that apple, it's so easy, it's right there.
Yeah.
You will be cast out of Eden. But so long as you don't take the apple, you live in Eden. And essentially, we took the apple.
Yeah, and there's a whole, I'm sorry, there's a whole bunch of jokes I'm suppressing about that. But yes.
But one thing we or there are things we can do also for southwestern Japan in this case, where we can plan to provide fairly quick indicators that something is up
Mhm.
with the system, so that at least when you're progressing in your little isolated island, you're going to be able to tell that you're probably in a minority and the system isn't converging the way it normally does,
Yes.
which will at least tell you that there is reason to be a little bit careful.
Mhm.
You know, not a disaster, but be on your toes. This transaction may take longer to be confirmed than normal.
Yes, exactly. And you can see that without the really important thing about a mechanism that can help establish this signal is that the nodes that are in the minority partition network can identify, hey, I think we're in the minority. We
Yeah, it's
need to
too
be
quiet
real,
suddenly, you know?
right, but
It's too quiet.
don't need to have, yeah,
Please.
the world gets quiet. You know, Alderaan just blew up. A million voices cried out in
So of
terror.
course, Dimitar and I could of course tell about the longest such event that we've seen was when Minority Island that happened to be a majority miner was isolated from the main network for about 700 generations and then came back and actually had a higher difficulty than the main network. It
Wow.
was sort of an accidental brute force attack, but very few transactions actually were sort of permanently evicted from the chain because pretty much everything came back. But it took us a few days to figure out what had happened because it looked like an attack first.
Mm.
It was quite interesting because it had all the hallmarks of an attack, but it was during COVID, network failure, you know, China, all that.
Mm.
Very interesting, and of course that's a quite a big partitioning. It's 700 generations, 3 minutes apart, roughly. You know,
Right. So the key takeaway from proof of work is that it's trustless. That comes with a lot of costs. It has exactly the properties that you need, though, to define your money base. That
Mhm.
nobody can mess it up. No one's got control over it. It's going to follow whatever the algorithmic curve is, and that's that. Nobody can mess with it. However, trustless consensus is not how we make the vast majority of decisions among humans. So we need something trustless to act as money. So your money base, your monetary base can't be in the hands of anybody, like under control of anybody. But that just gives you a basis from which you can now trade. And a proof of work system is not a good enough or flexible enough consensus system to work in all contexts. And this is where we get back to the blockchain trilemma has these weird properties, and you need to prioritize certain of those properties in certain contexts. And that's where the Gajimaru's associate chains solve this problem, where we have a mint, and that's why it's called the mint. It's the only place in the Gajimaru, of all the chains in the Gajimaru, it's the only place that can create money. And that has to be proof of work because it has to be trustless. It's going to be anonymous in most cases. You can't let anybody control that. So it's got to be proof of work. And there's no way to get away from that. You can't escape from this. Because proof of stake, which you would want on an associate chain, cannot be anonymous in nature. If it is anonymous, it's really easy to for me to take a bunch of money from the mint, put it on an associate chain, and make myself 15 of the 16 stakers. And now it looks like you've got a proof of stake chain. But really what you've got is like an authorized chain that I totally control, but it's anonymous, so you don't know how many of these staking accounts I've got.
Yeah, look,
Yes.
there's an interesting parallel here with Hashgraph, because one of the big pushbacks, and hands up, I had been working on this since 2002. I didn't step in when I saw Bitcoin come through, and I wasn't first on board with that. I saw that in probably 2010, 2011, and I concluded, like any good autist would, that it would never scale. It was a great proof of concept, and it was a fantastic thing for awakening a consciousness, but it wasn't going to work. Therefore, you couldn't build on it. Nice autistic flow of logic to an outcome that meant that I didn't become incredibly rich thanks to knowing that Bitcoin existed and punt a load of money I didn't have on its conversion from Bitcoin to Betcoin. I didn't come back in when I saw Ethereum. Again, same conclusion. Great idea, fantastic, but proof of concept will never evolve. Hedera was actually the thing that made me come back and say, yeah, I'll build this. Because for the first time, I saw the potential for something to work. But actually, the conversation I had with the founders of Hedera at the time was, I don't agree with how you're going to implement it, but I really like the idea. Could I license it from you, please? And that was where, in truth, my active working buy-in to all of the things that have taken us to this point, and where Bitcoin, about blockchain as a whole, came from. And what I didn't agree with, but I respect the thinking, is that Hedera's approach was say, okay, well, we're going to have 50 nodes, and those 50 nodes will be identified persons who are big corporates that we can trust and big universities who we can trust. And by the way, we'll always be one of those nodes. And then it became, well, we and Swirls will each have one of those nodes. And so it went on. But effectively, it was the apple again. And the point was, and we saw this with Canton recently. I laughed and said, when I read the Canton papers, I said, well, actually what they are is a central counterparty, which in a regulated financial services context is a very deeply regulated entity that is pretending to have a blockchain in order to evade actually having proper regulation for what they're doing. Because they are the node that sees every transaction. That is centralization. And this is what Hedera does, is it says we're going to have this governing council, which is fine if you think that that's what's necessary. The issue is that actually some actors are going to stay there. And that is very clearly the case, because the talk at the outset of having a moving feast of companies providing that service into the system has turned out not to be the case. Let's not get into all the other issues, because that's another whole other conversation. But fundamentally, they ate the apple. They chose to be the node that was involved in everything and get paid as a result for doing everything. So their business model is being a blockchain. And that's wrong. That's where you go wrong. You cannot be a blockchain whose business is being a blockchain. You are a resource, or you are not a blockchain. You are a resource, or you are not actually in Eden. You've eaten the apple. And it's something unbelievably important for people to understand, is why you don't eat the apple and why we need to make Eden anew. And I'm really stretching that metaphor out, but being able to say that the vast majority of human transactions occur between entities who have some knowledge or trust in one another is true. And certainly, whether that's a familial example or it's a business example, so many of the functions that we would take for granted don't need to occur in a trustless context. They can occur in a trusting context with known actors, to your point, Greg. And we touched on this the other day when we were talking about a conversation with with the Central Bank of Italy that I had a few years ago. And they wanted to have one network that would operate in such a way that all of the banks could be nodes and it could facilitate all of the small scale transactions, someone buying a cup of coffee, for example, in a shop. But they wanted something that was much, much more secure, again, back to the trilemma, and potentially much slower and more costly, that would provide certainty when there was a very large scale settlement between banks at an end of day state. So when you're talking about euros, even though euros are a non-currency, but that's another day's topic, you're transferring a few euros for a coffee, that's fine. You don't need to have that much externality of trust around that. It's quite a small transaction. It's not that significant. It becomes very significant when you're transferring €1 billion between Bank A and Bank B. And that's a really good example of, even within a microcosm of use, how you might establish different chains for different purposes with different objects and different compromises. So in chain A, you might say, well, hey, everybody who's a member, your proof of stake is that you have funds on deposit with the Bank of Italy, Central Bank of Italy. And so all of the banks are members of this chain, and they all have this proof of stake to say that we have an interest in the game and the outcome and everything else. And then another one where actually the Central Bank of Italy sees every transaction. It is the node. You can have different pieces. And then you might have one that says, well, hold on. If you're going to transfer money, because this is how it works, from Italy to Germany, in order to repay all that debt that they built the entirety of Mediterranean countries out with, then you want a trustless mechanism to do that. Unless, of course, you want to trust the ECB, which is a deeply political entity, so who would?
Right, but so what he's describing is different. The way the Gajimaro is structured is that the mint is the sole trustless origin of all the currency. But these sub-chains, these associate chains that branch out from that may have different consensus mechanisms that satisfy their particular context of use better. But if you're going, so let's say you've got the mint here, that's the origin of the money. Then you've got the Bank of Italy here, and they've got a permission chain. So it's like a stake chain. It's like a proof of stake chain, except you only got one staker. So they've got total authority. So they could make up any kind of system they want. The requirement for that chain, technically, it doesn't even have to be a chain. It just has to speak Gajimaro, basically. But you're trusting the Bank of Italy. If there's a screw up there, and you look into that ledger and they did something crazy, you sue the Bank of Italy. Like, you know who did it. There's no it's unambiguous who to blame, because they're the sole authority for this chain. Below that, you may have regional banks, and those regional banks may actually be connected together in a subchain where each one of those regional banks is a staker on that chain, all in some contention, and they have a vested interest in it not breaking, because the local people know who they are, and they're going to show it with pitchforks and torches and stuff, because that's what happens in local. That's why the local trust function is so important, to be local, not aggregated. So when we get to this huge global level, we need it to be trustless. But as you get closer down to a locality, you may have a trust function because you have known entities, and those even resolve down to known people that you can go talk to. So that's you're localizing trust, which is completely the opposite of anonymity. And that's where you can have proof of stake, proof of authority, things like that. And they work great in those contexts. And there's a concrete consequence to them for violating that trust too. This is all really important. But when the Bank of Italy or people from Italy want to transfer money back up to the Bank of Germany again, they might not really trust the ECB, because as Greg mentioned, ECB's profoundly political, and that's even putting it lightly. You would want that transfer to go through the mint to verify, yep, those are Gajus. I remember those Gajus because I put them down there and they're coming back now. Yep, we're good to go. And it goes out to another associate chain, but they've basically been verified. They got vetted in that step of passing through the mint, because the mint, nobody controls that. It's the trustless origin of all the money. And it just checked, yep, that money's real stuff. And that can't be faked. So that, for the same reason that you have to blow a star up to create gold, the underlying physics of that work out in a different way in pure math, where it's just about as difficult to fake the crypto going through the mint. Like,
And
that's not even a control of the so faking the number of let's just say that you did get control of the mining pool. You're able to, you do a massive attack on the mint. You still can't actually make money. You can't create the money out of nowhere. The existing Gaju, might be able to manipulate existing Gajus, but you can't create them out of nowhere. So even in that case, the money base itself is not being corrupted. And that's because everybody can verify the validity of the transactions at a minimum, will ensure that the money base doesn't change in some crazy way. So there's a lot of protections that work into that. And that's why having a proof of work mint is the correct thing to do. So when people say we don't need proof of work because whatever, it's gonna kill the zebras or whatever, that's, first off, that's nonsense, just frankly.
no,
And
penguins.
second,
Of course it's wrong because you said zebras. If it was penguins, they'd be right, right?
oh yeah, totally, yeah. So
So-
yeah, but that
So-
nonsense. How dare you? That stuff. It's, frankly, it's nonsense. That kind of nonsense is being used to scare people out of their own capacity for emancipation. Honestly, like that's literally what the game is on that.
But our proof of work is not that CPU intensive. So it burns much less electricity. It's memory
true.
bound. So
Also true. Yes.
proof of work and proof of work can be different. There are nuances for sure, and some are really much more memory intensive, as we are, and much more cheap on electricity, which is
That's true.
what you want to do. You're solving different type of puzzle that is not consuming that much electricity.
Talk
And
about
that's
that a bit,
good.
talk about that a bit more, because I said earlier that I made the analogy of putting a square on a wheel and wondering why it takes so much effort to turn the wheel, and thinking, oh, that doesn't work, because the approach that Bitcoin took is the square wheel. You're talking about, and we've touched on this, that we wanted to replace that square wheel with a round one. Describe the round one, explain to people, because the point that we've made well, I think, is that there are all kinds of different ways of reaching a proof of stake, and actually the profusion of so-called layer ones that are trying to offer a blockchain that is proof of stake demonstrates that. But not much has been done around having different proof of work algorithms. And actually, it's as rich a field as proof of stake. Over
It
to
is.
you,
Yeah.
Dimitar.
What kind of puzzle are you solving?
Over to you, Dimitar. Explain some of
Okay.
what we've done with this, because I think it's really interesting.
So what Bitcoin does, and there's this class of functions, cryptographic functions, that they take a piece of data and they, in an unpredictable way, they have an output, and that output can be it's pseudo-random. Before you start the function, you don't know what the result is going to be, and what it's called hashing. And what Bitcoin does, it take a blob of data and they produce a hash, and they check if that hash matches certain criteria, a certain amount of zeros. The hash is a string, and then if it does, oh, you found Waldo, good for you. But if it don't, you change one small bit inside the data blob, and suddenly you feed again to the hash function, and you produce a new hash, which is radically different, has nothing to do. And you don't know in advance how you can change which bit to change and how to change it. to get the amount of zeros you want from the hash because it's deterministic, but you don't know what's going to be looking like before you actually execute the function. And that's great, but it is CPU intensive. So basically, your CPU, your processor of the machine, is crunching numbers just to find a certain amount of zeros in a hash. This is good, and for a proof of concept is perfect. What we're doing is we're following a Cuckoo proof of work algorithm, which is not CPU intensive. So what you want from a good puzzle is that it takes some time. Now, every attempt is taking time. Every time you look for Waudu in the picture, it takes some time, right? You don't want the puzzle to be too easy, and you don't want to be easy to produce a hardware that really easily finds Waudu. But you still want to take some time, predictable time, if possible. And what the Cuckoo cycle does is it finds not a certain amount of zeros, but rather it finds a certain path in a graph structure. Like imagine a city map. You have to find a certain path in the city that meets certain criteria.
Or like one of those mazes that people say where
Yes,
you have to
yes.
try and get to the middle, but how do you get there?
Yes. The problem is that the maze doesn't fit in the. So computers have memory, and there are different types of memory, and there are some really expensive ones that are put in really small amounts in the CPUs themselves. And accessing those is really cheap and fast from computational point of view. But those memories are really expensive. Instead, what we use is currently SSDs that are living on the motherboard on the machine. And accessing memory from those is really, it takes more time. That's what we want from proof of work. So we put a really big maze inside the memory of the computer, and we find a path through it. But we can't keep that on the CPU memory. We access the memory of the computer itself. And this makes it memory bound, not CPU bound. So the memory access speed is what is limiting you finding the path faster. And this is not burning that much electricity. This is not boiling the oceans. Zebras and penguins are going to be fine, which is what we want. And it's still a really good approach for proof of work. There could be some, we had discussed previously, proof of valuable work. Is that what, Greg, you called it?
Proof of useful
useful
work,
work.
yeah.
Useful work,
Mhm.
yes. And this is a path we can certainly take further down the road. But for the time being, the memory bound proof of work is a significant step up towards improving proof of work.
So
Thank you.
there is a variant. There was a development with the Cuckoo cycle where the ASIC technology and memory technology actually allowed for ASICs with enough fast memory on chip to run the Cuckoo cycle. And this was used by a blockchain called Grin. I guess it's still up and running, and but it's not active. And there are actually mining machines that you can buy. They're like 5,000 euros or something. They're about 20 times more efficient than capable graphics card for mining Cuckoo cycle per watt. So that could also be a way to go if the thing to optimize for is energy efficiency. But yeah, still pretty energy lean mining algorithm, the cheapest in terms of energy expended that is known. So
thank you all for taking us through that. To the audience, it's a long video. You may see the whole thing. You may see slivers of it. Certainly, we will be editing chunks of it down. But equally, I think the value of this is that you can see us really talking through these things in a genuine way. We didn't script anything. Nothing has been done in a way that
obviously,
your take.
Yeah. I
Obviously.
think we insulted every single one of the groups that a few insulted, so sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry if we missed someone.
Dimitar is the nicest guy in the group, hence he apologized. The rest of us are sort of thinking, yeah, they earned it. But
No, I'm apologizing if my point is, I'm apologizing if we missed someone by chance.
The Clinton defense.
In all seriousness, this is a massive set of topics, and they interlink into so many different points.
Mhm.
I think it's artificial to try and talk about them without that context around them, and that makes these kind of discussions hard to have. And with the size of audience we have, I know there'll be very, very few people will view this now. But I hope in a few years' time, people look back at this and understand what we were thinking at the time and how we were thinking, and begin to understand what they are now using in that context and why it's important.
and actually the thing about being unscripted, I mean, that's the nice thing about long form unscripted dialogues is that it's really hard to be fake for that long. I mean, essentially, you're gonna people are gonna see through that. So we may be wrong in some assumptions, but at least we're laying them out there, and people can challenge us on it. But at least
Yep.
they shouldn't need to doubt our honesty. So if we're wrong, we're earnestly wrong.
We're pretty good at being wrong too. So
Oh yeah.
Actually, this
Um,
is something that you said, Craig, that I loved. You talked about that within this group, we don't have egos, and we don't have this issue of people trying to score points. People are genuinely trying to get to the right answer. And you talked about it's what did you call that? It's a fantastic statement, but I keep slipping exactly how you said it and
what the
rephrasing it.
good
and I
faith
shouldn't.
disagreements?
Thank you. Good
Yeah.
faith disagreements. Yes. The point is, and Ulf has made it very well here, is that everything that we're doing is the best that we can come up with through a Socratic process of discussion amongst people who are able to have disagreements with good faith. That the object is to get to the right answer. It isn't to say who's the smartest, who's the best, who has the biggest wallet. It's down to a desire to get to the right answer and deliver the answer that we genuinely believe through a very Socratic process is the right answer. And
Our-
I think that's something quite magical about this group that I was telling the guys this morning they should be incredibly grateful for, because my experience in other fields has been very different, that there are people whose motivations are mostly not about getting to the right answer. They're about aggrandizing the self, or just being cowards and running away from their responsibilities. But this group have not. And I think if you, the viewer, are able to see the authenticity with which we have come to this, the fact that even at the very outset of this, the guy who fluffed his lines to get this started was me. There were no lines. We were having a long discussion about something else, and then we segued to saying, well, let's do this. And I fluffed everything because I simplified it in a way that wasn't useful. I said, well, we're going to have a discussion about proof of stake and proof of work, as if that was such an easy discussion to have. But as we've clearly
Which
shown,
ultimately
it was
we did, but
We got there and we kind of skimmed across the surface of it because, you could go so much deeper on every one of these points.
We went as back as Adam and Eve, so
Yeah, we got all the way back to Adam and Eve, so we're doing well. But
Literally.
We'll go
one of-
further in the next video.
Yeah, one of the innovations that we want to implement is to start streaming some of these things and inviting people to join the stream and actually engage in the conversation with us, to add their questions in. And because sometimes one of the great things we've had in this group is Peter Santosh. Peter is a guy who's sort of been Bitcoin blockchain adjacent, but never immersed. He's coming in to handle how we're approaching the market in terms of getting the message out there. He's the CMO, and I really enjoy watching he and Craig discuss things in particular, because Peter comes in and says, "I have this question that's been itching at me for a while," and he describes the situation right in his thick Glaswegian accent. And Craig, God bless him, is able to understand Glaswegian. And he'll stop and he'll say, "Well, Peter, the reason why you're asking that question is because you're a good person and you're applying logic to the question, and there is no logic and there's nothing good about what's going on. Let me explain." And actually, it's really refreshing when you've been in this industry for as long as all of us have, that you take so many of the things that you say and discuss for granted. You think that everybody knows what you're saying. And then you have somebody who has the courage and genuinely the courage to say, "Hold on, what does that mean? What are you trying to say?" And I say the courage because one of the great tricks that this industry uses, and I watched a guy from Polygon do it masterfully on stage 2 years ago, is the ability to obfuscate and obscure the truth with very dense sounding, very technical sounding language that everybody in the audience is frightened to question because it makes them look dumb. Exactly like nobody questioned why the emperor was naked, apart from the little boy. They were all going, "Oh, the emperor's new cloak is magnificent. I mean, that shade of turquoise is just so special." And it's something that I think we think as a group that this is such a fundamental breakthrough for everything about how we will operate in the future. And anybody who tells you that blockchain and AI go hand in hand is wrong. They are opposing forces.
People say that?
Yeah, they do. It's the whole venture capital world at the moment has gone from saying we're all about privacy to
Oh,
we're all about
no.
your data.
Hey, we're going to take AI and cat healthcare on the
Seriously,
blockchain and fix the
You
world.
guys need to spend more time on LinkedIn. If you did, you'd see how many
No.
people are trying to create this fusion between AI and blockchain without understanding that the whole point of blockchain isn't just that we can trust the message, not the messenger, securely at scale. It's that you own your message. You own your data, not somebody else. And that is genuinely completely different from everything that's going on at the moment. And it's completely opposed to what AI is about. AI, or actually applied large language models is what they really mean, is all about your data being owned and monetized by somebody else.
Dude, I'm
And-
still trying to even
figure
out how.
Oh,
Yeah,
this is
what
going to
are
be
you
great. Let me
saying?
explain. No, hold on, Craig. I can tell you why that's a problem for you, because you're a good person and you're applying logic.
see how this
Oh,
backfires.
man. Yeah, dude, though, that's nuts.
Yeah, it is. But
I really am. That's going to bug me all the way home tonight. Like, how does that even?
here's the game. Pick the 10 biggest influencers. Do a Google search. Who are the 10 biggest influencers in blockchain? Then do the same search for who are the 10 biggest influencers in AI. And these are, of course, people who don't even know what AI is, because they're describing AI when they mean applied large language models, which are not the same thing. And again, the autist in me is coming out. But if you compare those two tables, you will find a disgusting amount of confluence. And
Wow.
what you come away with is you're not really an advocate or expert in these things at all. You are merely like a politician. There's a British politician who left the Conservative Party the other day and joined Labour, and somebody came up on Twitter saying, clearly a slow learner. And my response was, well, is she a slow learner? It would appear that she's quite a quick learner, actually, because modern politicians, they don't actually have any principles other than the ones that they can deduct from the latest Gallup poll, which tell them what they think and how they need to say it.
Well, they have a unique flexibility of conviction, I've found.
Yes, it's driven by whatever the latest poll numbers have told them, along with their political advisors who've told them that if you just say it this way, I mean, this is why I say that modern politics is basically, there are no principles in it. There's just the draftsmanship of a marketeer. But
You need to have a
Politics
really
is now
good get out of
Instagram.
jail card as well. The thing that Swedish politicians tend to say is, we have been naive. And there is no limit to how many times you can say that.
that's interesting. But at least
Will
they're
that work
trying to
with
be
my
honest.
wife?
Ooh, that's actually a great
Uh,
test. That's a great test, isn't it?
I'm sorry, I've been naive.
Yes. But look, to all the people watching this, we are trying to build a resource layer that everybody can own, everybody can use, that everybody can build upon. We're not going to own it, nor are you. We are all going to own it. We need to move away from, and I see a fig leaf of a marketeer's pen between socialism and corporatism. It ends up in the same point where a very small number of self-appointed, self-sustaining people have all of the chips and the rest of us are sitting in the mud. We need to move away from that. Capitalism is not about I win, you lose. It's I win, you win, we win. Because the only way that you get the best economic outcome is if everybody participates in the end. And
Took you a minute there.
yeah, and you can't get there unless everybody can own the infrastructure, or nobody owns the infrastructure. One of those two. The
Mhm.
reality is that you do have to pay for infrastructure to exist. So how do you do it? And a proof of work blockchain is the only way to begin to answer that question. But I think the point that we were all talking about through the last 2.5 hours is that it is only a beginning. The proof of work mint is the beginning, but the end is a multiplicity of answers that the Gajimaru offers the flexibility to deliver a pathway to. So unless anybody else has a closing comment to add to that.
I'd just like to point out that this conversation was, well, this discussion was sort of a topical mind dump of our thinking, but the course of it has gone not all that unlike actual work conversations that we have where we're trying to sort things out. One of which was occurring just before this, where I was looking at the minting curve and issues about that, and we were talking about the gas price and how that will interact with incentives to create associate chains or not, and so on. And my neat little nice system has a huge hole in it that Dimitar pointed out. I'm like, oh, duh! So now I got to go back and work out. But that's the typical process that we have, where one of us comes up with something that's nice and neat, and we think we've thought through the details, and we totally haven't. And somebody points that out, and we go, bah, and you got to go back and sort your thing out and come back with something that will work in a way that doesn't have to be hand doctored, so that it can be autonomous and just let go of, and market forces can do what they're supposed to do. Anyway, that discovery process is all about being wrong and being okay to be wrong, and that's fine. We're supposed to be wrong. We're
It's
people.
also about limiting how wrong we can be. Because
Yeah.
Yep.
if the Gajimaru as a resource layer goes into the world, to paraphrase what Ulf said earlier about you can do something that hides all of the possibility problems. I'm paraphrasing badly, forgive me, Ulf. That is that hides the complexity hides the problems, or you can have something where the simplicity exposes it. And if I paraphrase that badly, you can shoot me after the video, Ulf. But one of the things that we're very stuck on is the idea that everything that we do after we put the Gajimaru into the world is a different set of choices that we're going to make, and we're not going to force those choices on anybody else. It's one of the things that was said to me about why nobody has built a real blockchain that actually works before is because the metaphorical apple is too tempting. The thing is, nobody in this group is above the temptations of life, but we are all aware of our limitations in that regard. And I think to an extent, consciously or subconsciously, we've decided that there's a very strict limit on what we are allowed to tell everybody else that they should do. And actually, it's almost nothing. It's here is how you get the Genesis piece to work, which is the proof of mint core. And here's how it can work with all of the associate chains around that and all of those pieces. And from there, it's all your choice. And which choices, which compromises you want to make, they're yours, they're not ours. We're not going to tell you what to do or how to do it. If you want to do the version that we will do, go down this rabbit hole, but it's ours. It's not yours, and it's not anybody else's. It's only ever going to be the best solution set for a number of people, not for everybody. And I think that's something that I really admire about this group of people, that they are incredibly smart people, some of the smartest people I've ever dealt with, but yet they don't have egos about it. There's a humility and there's an understanding that we will all be wrong. They will all be wrong. And I say they because they've made more of the design decisions around this than I have. So in the end, if you want to shoot someone, FBI, CIA, etc., shoot these guys first.
Yeah.
Okay.
Seriously. I think that integrity that we know that the further you get into complexity, the more you're making decisions and the more you're enforcing your decisions upon somebody else, and you may not have all the information. That humility sits at the heart of why Gajimaru is a resource that we put into the world as a very simple start that everybody can make as complex as they want for their purposes. And with that, have we got any closing comments from anybody else?
I love you guys.
Yeah, let's see who survives by Monday. My best.
Hey, the Starliner didn't even take off, so none of us are to blame for that. Boeing product. We're good.
Okay,
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
thanks.
All right.
Bye.
bye.
Bye.